Good morning, members. The committee is resumed on the Land Transport Drug Driving Amendment Bill, the Taxation Annual Rates for 2024-25 Emergency Response and Remedial Measures Bill and Sentencing Reform Amendment Bill and the Customer and Product Data Bill. When we suspended last night, we were considering the Land Transport Drug Driving Amendment Bill and had begun the debate on Part 1. Once again, the question is that Part 1 stand part. Tangi Utakiri.
Good honour, Mr Chair. Good morning. It's a pleasure to take the first call of the morning. And last night, where we ended up at was, as you say, sir, at Part 1. There were a number of questions that we had posed to the Minister and the Chair, and there were some responses there that certainly on this side of the House we intend to delve in a little bit deeper. It's worth noting, Mr Chair, that obviously the position of Labour is in support of this bill up through second reading, and there are a few issues that we've identified previously in the second reading speech that we do want to address in this committee stage, sir, and there are a couple of amendment papers at this stage that I'm aware of in my name to address some of those concerns. This is an issue that Labour and government was very, very passionate about. Yes, it's accepted that there were some issues about being able to effectively roll that out. The interpretation system that the interpretation section of Part 1, where some of the questions were touched on last night, identified some of the changes that sought to roll that out. I asked the question of the Minister and the Chair at the time about whether it was appropriate that the Minister of Police was the appropriate person. I have a question for the current Minister and the Chair in that further on there is a requirement for certainly the Minister of Transport and the Minister of Science to be consulted, whether it's appropriate for there to be reference in Part 1 to those two executive members that hold those particular warrants for those portfolios. So whilst the Minister is defined as the Minister of Police, I think my view is certainly concede that perhaps is the most appropriate person to make the decision. However, what's contained in the legislation on the bill is reference to two other ministers. So when we get on to Part 2, there'll be a conversation about whether that should be added to or not. But when we're looking at Part 1, whether that definition is appropriate. One of the things that the Minister has yet to respond to are the concerns that the Attorney-General has raised in her report to the House, noting that the step that the Attorney-General took was a fairly unusual one. Unusual, sir, in respect that it is not often something that is engaged where it comes to the House. Certainly the Attorney-General does have that overriding responsibility to examine all bills and to ensure that they are consistent in this respect with the Bill of Rights. Now, there was a lot of conversation and questions put to the Minister last night, Mr Chair, around that issue. I think from memory there was a response, but it didn't really delve into the specific concerns that had been raised. It may be that the Minister is relying on moving through to those parts beyond Part 1 to explore those opportunities, but nonetheless it has been an issue that has been raised by at least a couple, if not more, members. I do have a question around the response that the Minister gave last night that I have to say was quite surprising, and that was around the operational matters for the police. This is something that the Select Committee did grapple with a wee bit, and I know Mr Foster, who chairs the committee there, will be aware that one of the... He is a fine chair, actually, I certainly accept that. One of the issues that the committee did grapple with was the tension between the operational requirements of the police and the rollout of these devices. And certainly my firm view is that this legislation should not be driven by procurement processes. This needs to be at a high level, set what is it we're seeking to achieve, and it is a reduction of deaths, fatalities and injuries on the roads. We certainly accept that. We're 110% behind that. But what came as somewhat of a surprise from the Minister's response last night was that the Police Minister can consider relevant operational matters. Now, on a day-to-day basis, yeah, okay, you can consider those, but we're talking about relying on a piece of legislation that is seeking to deliver change in the reduction of fatalities and serious injuries due to drug driving. And so that did come as a surprise, because throughout the select committee stage that it was mentioned, I accept that, but it wasn't seen as, nor was it accepted by the committee as the driving force or factor behind the decision. So I'm interested in those two responses from the Minister around the Attorney General, but also the operational requirements of the police in relation to this.
Arana Williams.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Following on from last night's discussion, what the Minister laid out for the Committee of the Whole House, which is an important part of this legislative process because the two major parties are in agreement on this. We need to see this legislation through, and we have been working very collaboratively in committee to make it a piece of legislation that we can all support. So this committee stage represents something that is really necessary in this phase, and we have an amendment on the table in the name of the Honourable Chris Bishop that we are trying to basically do the same work with to make sure that it works. And so I asked the Minister a series of questions about how the amendment paper affected Part 1, and the response was around a new provision to allow a oral screening test to be paid for at the election of a person who was having, say, a second test. And that was when the answers around the Minister having regard to operational requirements came out for the House. And so we need to really test for the benefit of everyone here what that means, because it was something that was really key to the cross-partisan support, was understanding both the need practically to allow police to run a procurement process which was as flexible as possible, because we need them to be able to deliver these services. You know, when you've got ministers in the House at question time saying that police are going to be rolling these out, these are things that people should expect to happen. There should be as much operational ability to be able to procure the right kind of tests in a timely fashion as possible to be able to do that when people expect that this is coming. But on the other hand, in the committee room, there were legitimate concerns around what was being reasonably proposed here for the procurement. No one in the committee thought that we would be procuring tests that would get someone on the side of the road for an hour, Mr Chair. No one in the committee thought that it would ever be reasonable to pull someone over for a longer time than that, or to do a more invasive test than the ones we saw, which used either a sample of saliva or a swab. That is also relevant, Mr Chair, because that's what the Attorney General thought when she considered the weighing up exercise that is required on what is a reasonable curtailment of people's rights and what is not. So what we're asking here, when the Minister told us that, and the Chair, the Honourable James Meagher, told us that the Minister of Police would have regard to operational requirements when making a decision, we want to know what those operational requirements would be, and whether that is in fact the way that we will formulate the exercise of public power that the Minister is making there when he is the decision maker in this case, because that's not what necessarily the Attorney considered. And last night we had a really useful back and forth with the Honourable James Meagher about the reasonable balance of rights and the right kind of public policy reason for limiting rights, but not actually sort of what was being reasonably curtailed. And that's the question here, because if you have one oral test and then you introduce another oral test and then you have a blood test, that's what's being reasonably curtailed. And so our questions are about, well, actually, if that's the stepping out of the process and that's what's being amended here, then we need to know what is the likely time there. That is also something that the Attorney didn't consider in the Bill of Rights reporting that was brought to this House. And so we just want to step ourselves through and make it clear on the record what sort of a reasonable time expectation is. If we have this step which is being introduced by the amendment paper, we want to understand that step that's being introduced by the amendment paper, and that's why we've been asking questions about the balancing exercise. And I think as well, Mr Chair, you will know that opposition members will have more questions about the Bill of Rights in a later part of this bill, and that it is not directly relevant to Part 1. But what we are raising here is the reasonableness and the time expectation of what is being curtailed by the amendment paper that relates to Part 1, because we have not had an opportunity to consider the amendment paper at committee, and so we just really want the Minister to walk us through what how long are we expecting this to take? Because you'll notice, if you do read through the Attorney General's report, that it's very practical. This isn't a document which is high level. This isn't some sort of arcane rights balancing exercise. It's very easy to read. What we're saying here is it's reasonable to pull someone over for a breathalyzer test at the moment. We say that's fine. We say that's a reasonable search and a reasonable detainment on the side of the road. But, Mr Chair, just to finish this point.
You can finish, but just aware that the amendment paper, I know it relates to Part 2. I'll need good context around 1, which you are doing, but just you'll need to continue
Understood, Mr Chair.
Strongly to do that.
No, understood, Mr Chair. Just to finish this point, the amendment that I'm asking about is the step to allow a person to elect to have an oral fluid sample sent to the lab at their own cost. We want to know whether that adds to the Attorney General's analysis and whether that was something new that the Attorney General did not consider. We haven't stepped through with the Minister what that process looks like. So we're quite keen to have that stepped out. That's why I asked the Minister as a first question, sounded like a patsy, walk us through the amendment. And it really is. You know, we believe in this, we want it to work. Let's all understand the Part 1 amendments in the amendment paper and whether they align with what the Attorney General was considering when she gave us her rights analysis.
Scott Willis.
Thank you, Mr Chair. This is my first opportunity to take a call on this question, and I can say with confidence that we do support safer roads and we support an evidence-based way of getting there. And this bill seeks to amend the Land Transport Act 1988 by changing the testing threshold from an oral fluid containing evidence of use to an oral fluid that indicates use of qualifying drugs. So my question really starts with what is the evidence base we're using to see whether this is an effective way of ensuring safer roads. We've heard from the New Zealand Drug Foundation submission that there's a proposed oral fluid screening regime does not penalise driving while impaired by drugs. Instead, it penalises prior ingestion of certain qualifying substances, the majority of which are prescription medicines. So my question to the Minister is, how are we going to avoid penalisation of those who have ingested prescription medicines? And I appreciate that the Minister we have in the chair at the moment lives rurally, because we know rural dwellers do tend to be high users of prescription drugs as well as other drugs. But how are we going to tell the difference? How are we going to be able to choose between those prescription drugs and other drugs? That's my first question here, and I think we've got a second question which comes from the Attorney General's concern about overruling Bora, because this proposal is conducting screening tests in a very discriminatory manner. Why not use a less discriminatory manner, such as the existing approach for universal screening at drink driving checkpoints, which doesn't target specific groups, doesn't have an over-reliance on ethnicity, or what we anticipate this bill could well do. As we know, there are biases in the way we address things. So my second question is really about how we're going to ensure that this is not discriminatory, how we might apply it in a more universal manner, such as the universal screening at drink driving checkpoints. So just to return to the first question, if we understand that the screening regime doesn't penalise while impaired by drugs, but does penalise any prior ingestion of qualifying substances, which include prescription medicines, how on earth are we going to make sure that we only get those who are impaired and impaired by illegal substances? How on earth are we going to ensure that this is justified for all of those people who, for one reason or another, have to take prescription drugs, are safe, are able to drive? How is this bill going to ensure that we are not simply acting in a way that is irresponsible for our communities, and particularly for our rural communities, where we know that there are so many people who have been injured, who need care, and who are ingesting prescription drugs? So 2 questions for the Minister. I would really appreciate an answer if we could, and I can follow up later. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
I just will note that the actual methodology of stopping is mostly in part 2 of this as well. So members, I would ask them to just, in concerning the question, it's a relatively narrow part, so if we can keep it to that. Lawrence Yunnan, Dr. Lawrence Yunnan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want to focus on the question that I asked last night that we still haven't received a response from the Minister on, and this is to do with the definition for the family of qualifying drugs as we see in Section 2 of Part 1. And I think just going back to, just a reminder to the Minister, going back to the question I had yesterday, that, you know, in the Principal Act, Schedule 5 of Part 1, we do see a list of currently the threshold for existing high-risk drugs and in terms of the amount that is considered a high risk. But what we are not seeing is the fact that the definition here for qualifying drugs also includes other ones with a similar chemical structure and specifically names benzodiazepine and amphetamine as having some of those similar chemical structures. Now, I mentioned before, as the Minister would be aware, that for a chemical compound to be considered to be a benzodiazepine, all it requires is to have a benzene ring as well as a diazepine ring. And in these cases, it considers and covers other particular drugs, for example, that are not part of the list, such as bromazepam and other forms of anxiolytic. And I'm just curious that there is nothing in this bill, nor is amendment that suggests that other forms of drugs that is not currently listed under Schedule 5 of Part 1 doesn't actually have a corresponding amount or threshold in terms of what is considered high risk. So if we're looking at specific drugs that are not part of that list, but does have a similar chemical compound or similar chemical structure, like what I just said with bromazepam, what is the safe amount for those? And then an example to give is there are other ADHD treating drugs, such as those that are CNS stimulants, so central nervous system stimulants, that do contain or do have a similar structures as amphetamine. And would those also, what is the safety threshold for those as well? Because again, it is not part of this bill or including this amendment. The last question I have in terms of the definition for family of qualifying drugs is in 2B, which talks about qualifying drugs that have a similar effect, including pharmacological effect on the user. Now, pharmacological effect on the user vary from user to user because of the fact that the whole point of pharmacology is the way that the drug interacts with the human body, and human bodies interact differently depending on your own body makeup and genetics and, and all of those variables. Would the test be able to pick up on the nuance or specifically just pick up on the amount of drug that's present in the system? And if we're looking at something that is on pharmacological effect on the user, who and how it is determined what those pharmacological effects are going to be? when a person is being pulled over. So I think just around the context of the qualifying drugs, which seems to expand beyond the scope of the Principal Act, and how that would look in practice. If the Minister wouldn't mind answering those questions, that would be wonderful.
Mr. Chair.
Francisco Hernandez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to take my first call on the Land Transport Drug Driving Amendment Bill during the Committee of the Whole stage, and pleased to see that a fellow Dunedinite is the Minister who's answering questions for this part. Now, for this section, I would like to ask questions to test my understanding about the legislative intent of this bill, and obviously I'm willing to take guidance from the Chair of whether these questions properly belong in this part of the bill. So my question is around the legislative intent of it. So I've read through the speeches during the first reading and second reading. In the first reading speech, it was the Honourable Matt Ducey who said that, during his speech, he said that part of the legislative intent was to keep New Zealanders safe on roads, and he alluded to, the 65, lives that are being lost. And during the second reading speech, the Honourable Chris Bishop alluded to drug deterrence as one of the legislative intents of this bill. And during the introduction speech in this stage of the debate, the Honourable James Meagher, I'm not sure if they're still honourable when they get inducted as ministers or whether they have to go to cabinet first. I'm not sure what the rules are, but I think he is an honourable at this stage. He mentioned deterrence, and he also mentioned the fatal road crashes issue.
Point of order, Tim Costley.
I just asked for some guidance for you. I'm not sure entirely where the line sits, but in terms of hearing a member question the honour of one of our ministers,
no.
I just wonder what your guidance would be.
No, that wasn't what I heard.
Yes.
I think you were just explain what you were.
I was wondering whether they become honourable when they're ministers or whether they need to be promoted to cabinet before they become honourable. I wasn't sure.
That was what I heard.
Yeah.
It was more a matter. He isn't. I can assure you.
I would never.
Having welcomed his first
I would never.
honourable,
I would never question
that
it.
He is an honourable and was so promoted. Yeah. So to clarify that.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would never question the honour of a former fellow OUSA exec member and a former Otago graduate, no less. So the legislative intent seems to be, from these speeches, is to reduce the death toll on the roads, make the roads safer, and to deter and detect drug driving. So if say in 5 to 10 years that the incidences of drug driving and safety incidents in New Zealand haven't gone down, would this government have considered this legislation to be felled? And the second part of the question is, has the minister or their officials looked at the legislation, what's happened in the legislation that's occurred overseas since the introduction of drug driving laws? And just for a little bit of context, for my sins, I've also worked for the Australian Greens in the New South Wales Parliament as a legislative staffer there. And one of the issues that we talked about then was roadside drug testing. And I had a look this morning about what's happened to the hospitalization stats since the expansion of the mobile drug testing regimes. And in 2014 there was something like 10,800 hospitalizations from crashes, and when I last checked in 2023, which is when there was a last full year of statistics, the statistics hovered around a similar number. So, despite the expansion of quite comprehensive drug testing regimes, it doesn't seem to have made the situation in New South Wales much safer. And this has come at quite substantial cost as well. I think the figures were something like 10 or 15 million per annum for the cost of expanding these services. So, again, the question is at what stage what is the criteria for success for this government in terms of introducing this legislation? And if the legislation is either not reducing the incidences of drug driving or reducing the sort of fatalities and crashes on the road, will it revisit the legislation down the track? Thank you.
Well, Mr. Hernandez, I'll say that's some broader policy issues there that go a little bit away from number one, but the Minister looks like he's keen to answer. So the Honourable Mark Patterson.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I'll address that last question first because, we're deep in the weeds here in some of the technicalities of the bill, but let's stretch it out here. This is not a good thing, having people driving around under the influence of drugs. We're intending to do something about this. I think it's something the previous government looked at doing. We're intending to deliver on that, and there are some technicalities around that. We are working through that today, but of course, I'm sure successive governments will look upon making this as effective as they can, but these are the measures that we are putting in place in this time, and we tend to deliver on them. Can I just cover some of the points that have been made, of the more substantive ones, to Arena Williams' point of how the amendments in Part 2 impact Part 1 of the bill. We will cover that in Part 2. They're substantially Part 2 of the bill, and we're not there yet. To Mr. Ukulele, can I ask for a minute? The member for Palmerston North, Tangi, my coal shovelling colleague from Palmerston North. So around the requirements, should there be requirements for the Minister of Transport and Science to have a more defined say? Those definitions are already in the Land Transport Act and covered off the technicalities that you were looking at there. And also the question around having regard to operational requirements when approving screening devices and what is involved. The bill does require the Police Minister to consider two factors when approving a screening device: accuracy and positive device thresholds that are indicative of recent drug use. Other issues, such as the time it takes for a device to return a result, is an operational matter that police will consider before making a recommendation to the Police Minister to approve a particular screening device. And we did hear yesterday a rather alarming example of Mr. Foster not being able to provide a test in time. We could call this the Foster Clause. So as examples of that come through and the police are operationalising these matters, they will be able to inform the Police Minister and make recommendations. So that is how that clause will work. And just addressing and refuting actually Mr. Willis's comments around bias, I think the New Zealand Police Force are an incredibly professional force. We have absolutely backed them on this side of the House, and I think insinuations that they'll somehow be biased when operationalising this legislation we would refute. Thank you.
Honourable Julianne Gento.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I did have some questions last night that we were waiting for answers from the Minister and the Chair at the time. That was a different Minister. I'm not sure if I'll just reiterate those. And they are about the specific number of crashes, fatal and serious injury crashes, that they expect to be prevented by the oral fluid roadside drug testing regime, noting that it's not just, a lot of times the government refers to the number of drivers that in fatal crashes who tested positive for some substance. However, these oral fluid tests, and we heard in Select Committee, will not test for all the substances. So that, they can only test for maybe 5, but more likely they will only test for 1 or 2. So they won't be preventing all of the fatal crashes that are involved with some level of substance being present. But the main issue I wanted to bring up in this and question in this part is under subpart 2 and part 1, so clause 5, subclause 1. And this is really the crux of the issue, because this bill is previously to this. The rules have been around responsibilities of drivers not to drive while impaired, and that is the key issue. It's not being impaired. Happily, when it comes to alcohol breath tests, there's a really good correlation. There's still some individual variation, but there's very, very strong correlation between what the breath test picks up, blood levels of alcohol, and impairment. But this subpart is saying that persons are not to drive or attempt to drive while blood contains evidence of or oral fluid indicates use of a qualifying drug. And that's quite different because we heard substantial evidence, both with the original legislation that this is amending and this bill at Select Committee, about the difficulties in establishing impairment and about the possibility that some of the qualifying drugs can be present in blood and in oral fluid even when there's no impairment. So I guess the question for the Minister and for the government is, what is going to, how are we going to deal with this situation of the possibility that people can test positive? For example, we heard from the Drug Foundation, recent Australian research involving drivers who used either orally ingested or inhaled prescribed medicinal cannabis found no notable evidence of driving impairment. And this is despite drivers recording blood concentrations of THC, which would be above the high-risk blood concentration level of 3. Up to 6 hours after taking their medication. So this study suggests that medicinal cannabis or medical cannabis used as prescribed has a negligible impact on simulated driving performance, but despite no observable driving impairment, they will have detectable concentrations of THC in their oral fluid for a duration of up to 6 hours. And this is the crux of the issue when we bring in oral fluid tests, is that the research is not there to establish impairment. And there's a very good chance that people who are legally taking a prescribed medication can fail 2 oral fluid tests, then be banned from driving for 12 hours, and then have to potentially go through a lengthy process to ensure that they don't have an infringement and demerit points, and potentially they won't be able to. I mean, they can say they've been taking it as prescribed, but the issue is that if we are now saying that people need to not drive or attempt to drive while there's any evidence of using a qualifying substance, how are people meant to know? Like, how will they know if they're legally taking prescription medication? If they're legally taking medication and they're not impaired and they have a right, they should be able to drive, but they're not going to be able to drive because of this. Well, take a call.
If we can keep
We'd
our,
love to hear from government members there. So if oral fluid testing is not accompanied by reliable impairment assessment, like when it comes to pain management and cannabis use, if they are not impaired, they're not at risk at driving in a way that's going to be dangerous, but they're still going to fail the oral fluid test and the blood test because they have to take the medication, Mr. Chair, they have to take the medication to be able to go on with their lives. We've heard people take this medication to be able to live with chronic pain, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to address this point that's similar to ones that made by Mr. Hunan and Mr. Willis earlier. Of course, there is, and the member, Ms. Genter, referred to it in her question, that there is, of course, the defence for prescription drugs. So there is a process to go through. Obviously, it's a bit messy. There's a grey area there potentially that you don't know if you're in or out of, but there is a process to go through. And I'd say that, as has been pointed out by some of the commentary coming from my right here, that it is on the boxes or in the prescriptions, you get advice. It's no different to the alcohol situation where you can, there is some discretion that you have to use. You can still have a beer or a glass of wine and drive and still be within the limit. This is the same scenario we're talking about here, and there is the defence of the prescription that I'm sure will be utilised for those people that may be inadvertently caught out by these rules.
Tony Utakiri.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and can I thank the Minister for his answers to some of those questions that I did put. In particular, I want to thank him for the clarity around the police operational consideration, because that is quite different. His response is quite different to the response that was given. Well, actually, it wasn't a response. It was basically part of the contribution from the Minister, James Mega, who was in the chair last night, who basically indicated that the Minister would be required to consider, quote, relevant operational matters, end quote. What the Minister has very helpfully clarified, today's Minister, Minister Patterson, has very helpfully clarified, is that is not the case, that the operational matters will be considered by the police in terms of what they propose as suitable or not to the Minister of Police. So I think it is important that that has been clarified, because members, certainly on this side of the House, were very surprised to hear that from the Minister last night, that suddenly there would be this change that is not reflected in the Transport Minister's amendment paper that has been tabled, number 256. So I do thank the Minister for the clarity. Mr. Chair, there was a question that I wanted to pose to the Minister that was in direct response to an answer that he gave last night. I do seek your guidance. If you wish to curtail my question and say that it needs to be at another part, I'm happy to do that. But I raise it now.
Well, it's useful to relate it to the part that you're actually...
This is about the implications as to when things would be rolled out. Because last night the Minister indicated that there was, quote, the utmost confidence that this government would be able to effectively roll this out. And he indicated that it would be operational basically in time for Christmas, December of this year. Now, he cited that there had been a change to the date in that it was April. Now, I note that that is in the commencement, title and commencement sort of section, so I'll park that to a further contribution, sir. But it does raise some concerns about some of the issues that were brought to the attention of the Select Committee when considering how things would be defined, and they are contained in Part 1, as to how that would be rolled out. Because we are talking about, and I can refer specifically, Mr. Chair, to the definitions that are proposed to be changed, and in the Amendment Paper 256 in Minister Bishop's name, he identifies a number of definitions there. Now, if we look at the actual Part 1, that's where the definitions and interpretation is contained in its entirety. So my question to the Minister is how the level of comfort exists that those things that are defined can actually find their way to, I guess, roll out by December, or in December, well, by the end of this year, basically. The other question, I note that the Minister...
You have answered your own question, that you are right, it does belong in the commencement. But
yes, that's right. So, and I did indicate that I would talk about that when we got to the commencement, so thank you, sir. When the Minister has responded to my colleague Aotearoa Williams' question about, well, we'll get to that Part 2, the question really is, what Minister Bishop is proposing as a change to Part 1 is contained in Clause 4(2). There are not many changes that that Minister Bishop seeks to implement here or suggest change, but one is a new definition, and the definition is that of an elective oral fluid sample. This is new. This is something completely new. This is not something that actually was provided at Select Committee. This is something that came out. What has led to this may have been provided through Select Committee in the report, but we are yet to hear an answer. Why has the Minister sought to introduce a new term called elective oral fluid sample? Now, it might mean because the person that seeks to have that oral fluid sample elected as of right, which does go to mitigate some of the concerns of the Attorney-General, but we still have not heard a response or an answer around why he has decided to implement or suggest that particular change. The other three changes in the Minister's amendment paper are in relation to Section 71D sub 2 and referencing also the new Section 71DE. So I would be interested to hear from the Minister, please, what is the explanation of those particular changes? Because they are new. They haven't been sort of explained to this committee as to what they seek to do. It might just be that it is a change in reference. It might not. But why is it that those need to be... why is the Minister seeking those amendments, or the government seeking those amendments?
Alana Williams.
It does surprise me that that government members are taking closure motions in a bill which is supported around the House but is intended to be the best piece of legislation it can possibly be, and we still have a minister who hasn't answered questions about what his amendment does. The questions we have been posing to the minister today and the minister and the chair last night were about how the amended Section 71D and 71DG then work with the consequential amendments which have been put in, and whether the new process meets the kind of, and the members say repetition. It wouldn't be repetition if the minister had just stepped us through what those new sections introduce. Because, members, what we are faced with here is a bunch of really practical, ordinary considerations about how you should detain people on the side of the road. These aren't criminals. These are not people that the ACT Party or the National Party want to put in jail because they've been bad and they've taken naughty drugs. They're you and me because we've been pulled over at a stop or at a random check, just like drunk driving, which we accept as completely normal, and we're asking the minister to step us through. Do his changes introduce more time into the system? Do his changes introduce a more invasive search into the system? Because if you've got more time and you've got a more invasive search, then you've got a different kind of thing than what the Attorney General, your Attorney General, your Cabinet Minister, considered when she considered the rights-based analysis that she went through. And we have these processes for a reason. And the reason we have these processes is because Parliament can't do whatever it likes to people. And it certainly can't do whatever it likes to people who come with completely clean hands at the side of the road when they're driving their kids in the back. Government members seem to think that it is completely normal for the government to legislate on over the top of ordinary citizens' rights who have a right to privacy, a right to not be searched randomly, a right to get home on time with the kids in the back of the car. We want the minister to explain, has he introduced more time? Has he introduced a stricter sense of detention with these new amendments? They are to Part 1. Their definitions are in Part 1. We haven't had that answer. That is why we will continue to ask it until we have the right minister who can answer it. We need to understand this because it was key to the committee's cross-partisan support that it was a reasonable amount of time, that it was a reasonable sort of detention. We want to make sure that what we are supporting here gives the police the right kind of powers that will stand up in court. I mean, the other thing to take into account here is that we all want this to work. We don't want tons of cases clogging up the court system about whether it was reasonable to even have this public exercise of decision-making in the first place, that it was reasonable for police to procure a device that had a reasonable sort of time frame to it and required the right kind of pulling over on the side of the road. Because actually what we've got here...
Ms Williams, I will say that the actual practicality of the test is in the next section, Part 2.
I will...
You are spending an inordinate amount of time in the next section.
Let me ask the Minister then a simple question which I think will go to the heart of these changes to Part 2. Minister, does the changes to the definition of second oral fluid testing and its subsequent amendments, which are to Part 1, change the inputs into the Attorney General's analysis of rights? Because given that Section 71D and 71DG create new processes, did the Attorney General make her rights-based analysis on a similar sort of time frame and a similar sort of detention?
Scott Willis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm very grateful that the Minister did want to engage on the question of police bias previously, because we would like, well, I would particularly like the Minister to think about the August 2024 independent report understand police delivery, where it was reported that being Maori increased the likelihood of prosecution by 11% compared to New Zealand Europeans. Now that's in August 2024, that's only last year, mid-last year. And these are findings that demonstrate inequities for Maori and other ethnic groups, disabled people, in their interactions with the New Zealand Police. Now this is an independent report that the police themselves commissioned in March 2021.
No, Mr. Willis, normally the Minister did bring this up, but he did bring it up in response to you bringing it up, and it wasn't as part of this section. This is not, we are, as I indicated before, you are now into an area well outside what we're talking about in part one. Now, I know the Minister mentioned it, but he was in response to actually yourself, so you had actually introduced it into the argument outside the realm of section of part one.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are you, Mr. Chair, are you suggesting that I've been fishing for the Minister? I don't believe that that's not, I would never consider such a thing.
Well, I know your fishing skills are apt, so I would expect that you may have been optimistic in doing that. So if we can go back to part one, please.
Okay. Well, look, I appreciate, and I certainly would like a response to the suggestion that there isn't bias, because what we do know is that there is a concern that by not having any universal screening, such as happens at drink driving situations, this will lead to that type of bias. So my question really is about that screening ability in the bill. How on earth are we going to overcome, how can we put this another way, the lack of accuracy that might occur? And I'll leave it there because I know my colleague has another question, but I would appreciate a response from the Minister, since it's been part of our discussion to date, and it is an important point nevertheless.
The Honourable Minister, but before he does, we are now getting broadening out from part one, so be warned.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I will address that last point first from Mr. Willis, and I probably brought this upon myself by responding to his earlier allegation, because I thought it was very unfair on the New Zealand Police to make that allegation. But I will point the member to the fact that this is an empirical test. If you're either pass or you don't. So that's it's not something where bias can occur. The test is in the data. The data's in the test. So ethnicity or gender or what has nothing to do with it.
Don't belabour that point, please, anymore, Minister, because that's the, it'll invite more.
In response to Mr. Aotearoa, hopefully that's a bit of a better effort, Tangi, a very sensible member for Palmerston North. And why is the definition of elective oral fluid sample inserted? This is inserted to support the proposed changes in the amendment paper, which provide for a person to provide an elective sample if needed for possible future independent testing. And that is, of course, discussed further in part two. And to Arena Williams' point is, does the amendment paper propose a more invasive search? Again, this is a part two matter, but to get ahead of the play now, no, the amendment paper provides for an elective sample if needed to enable a person to seek independent analysis. Mitigates concerns that the bill reported back that if it could require prolonged detention to attain a sample of oral fluid sufficient for both laboratory and independent analysis. Thank you.
Honourable Julianne Genter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm still hoping that the Minister, with assistance from the officials, can come back with some specific numbers on the estimated number of deaths and serious injuries that will be prevented by this policy, and also a further question to that: to what level would it have to be rolled out to achieve that reduction? So, as we understand with alcohol breath testing, the deterrence aspect is the key rationale for it, is to stop people from driving under the influence of alcohol. And that has to be done at a very large scale, and it can be done at a very large scale because alcohol breath testing doesn't cost very much. It's just a few cents, really, per test, compared to the oral fluid tests, which are several dollars per test at least, and the alcohol breath tests only take a short period of time, less than a minute, whereas we've seen lots of evidence that the oral fluid tests could be detaining people for well over 10 minutes. I just want to refer to the Attorney General's Section 7 report, which they found both unwarranted seizure on the basis of this bill, as well as arbitrary detention. Paragraph 62, on balance, I consider there's a real risk of arbitrary detention where an initial oral fluid screening takes in excess of 15 minutes, or where an individual is unable to provide a sufficient oral fluid sample and instead must provide a blood specimen. And the error rate of oral fluid testing could lead to prolonged detention of individuals on the basis of inaccurate testing. So I guess it says the bill provides inadequate safeguards in these situations. Can the minister tell us if the amendments made at select committee or the amendment paper that has been put forward for this committee stage addresses in any way? Have we had any further feedback from the Attorney General on whether it would provide a safeguard? I suspect the answer is no. But all of the government's rationale for the basis of that this is warranted, that this, people potentially losing their ability to drive for 12 hours.
Ms. Genter, you're well into the policy. You actually answered this yourself, the broader policy issues. If you can relate it to what we are here now is the actual test.
Well, we're back to subpart 2.
And also the next part we'll talk about.
It's subpart 2, amendments to part 2, which is in part 1 of this amendment bill, clause 5. And the minister and the chair yesterday evening did answer questions about this, but said that he believed it was justified on the basis that it would result in less harm on our roads. So that's why I come back to my question, which I've asked multiple times, and no minister in the chair has addressed my question about the specific evidence that it actually will prevent harm. And I think that should be answerable. That is a reasonable question to ask. And just making the point that, here we are changing the law to say that people cannot drive or attempt to drive simply because of the presence of something that's quite a big difference from what it has previously been. And it means that people might lose their ability to drive, might be detained simply for taking their medication. We know so the Drug Foundation said 19 out of 25 substances with legal blood thresholds under the Amendment Act are prescription medications. And that people can be, they can be. So for example, if the members want to read, one, take a call, but two, read the actual submissions and the evidence, it says they would not, so under the NZTA's medical aspects of fitness to drive, a guide for health practitioners states that an individual on oral methadone treatment program may continue to drive if the individual is stable in the program and their methadone treatment is unlikely to affect their ability to drive safely. They would not be considered impaired despite blood and oral fluid levels potentially showing concentration of opiates that would be considered high for opioid-naive individuals. The issue is that these substances and their impact on people's ability to drive is not the same as alcohol. And you will potentially, with this bill, be banning people from driving, which in many parts of the country they have no alternative, when they're not impaired. And do we think this is a reasonable or just thing to do? If people have oral fluid or blood levels of medicine that they are legally prescribed and they should be able to drive, they can still fail this oral fluid test, they can still be detained, they can still lose the ability to drive, and those members on the other side do not care. And there's no evidence that this is actually going to improve road safety or reduce deaths and serious injuries.
Vanessa Winnick.
I move that debate on this question now close.
The question is that debate on this question now closed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. The party vote is called for. Please conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National.
49 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes opposed.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
15 votes opposed.
ACT New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Te Pāti Māori.
6 votes opposed.
The ayes are 68, the noes are 55. The question is agreed. The question is that the Minister's amendments to Part 1 set out on AP number 256 be agreed to. All those in favour say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question is that Part 1 as amended stand apart. All those in favour say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Members, we come now to Part 2. This is the debate on clauses 7 to 25, amendments to Part 6, driving offences involving drink or drugs and penalties and procedures. The question is that Part 2 stand apart.
Mr Chair.
Mr Chair.
The
Mr.
Honourable Mark Patterson.
Mr Chair, I would like to take the opportunity to cover some of the issues around Part 2 because the committee has shown a willingness to prosecute this bill and make it into the best possible shape that it could be. So in outlining the government's position on Part 2, this is the most substantial section of this bill and amending provisions to the Land Transport Act that covers drug driving offences, enforcement procedures and the Minister of Police's powers to make notices approving oral fluid screening devices and specifying listed qualifying drugs that can be tested for laboratory by an approved analysis. I draw attention to Clause 22, which replaces Section 71G of the Act. This section sets out the approval criteria for oral fluid screening devices. The current Section 71G is in the Act prevented the implementation of roadside testing regime as there is no commercially available testing device that met the approved criteria. Under the new approval criteria, the Minister of Police must consider the accuracy of the device in light of the requirements for screening oral fluid. Devices are not 100% accurate. They can produce both false negative and false positive results. In recognition of this, there must be 2 positive roadside screening tests before a driver is prohibited from driving for 12 hours, which may address any road safety issue. There must be a positive laboratory test before an infringement notice is issued. The Police Minister must also consider the positive screening threshold used by the device and the extent to which the threshold indicates recent drug use. The regime targets recent drug use as a proxy for impairment. When considering this matter, the Minister must also have regard to any relevant standard. The current Australia-New Zealand standard for oral fluid testing sets out device cut-off thresholds for some drugs that are widely accepted as indicative of recent use. Part 2 of the bill also includes enforcement procedures for the new regime. A police officer will be able to stop any driver or motor vehicle to administer an oral fluid screening test without the need to suspect drug use. The ability to stop any driver at any time is a critical component to oral fluid testing regime. A driver that has a positive result from a first oral fluid screening test will be required to undergo a second test, and an oral fluid sample or samples will be sent for laboratory analysis. A driver who receives 2 positive oral fluid screening tests will be prohibited from driving for 12 hours. To address any immediate road safety risk, but will only incur an infringement penalty following a positive result from a laboratory test. The Select Committee introduced an ability for a person who has been issued with an infringement notice to elect to have an oral fluid sample independently tested. This aligns with the existing blood testing regime for alcohol. If a person chooses to do this, they need to pay for this independent test. Under the bill, as reported back from Select Committee, drivers that test positive on first screening test would need to provide a sufficient sample of oral fluid for laboratory and independent testing. Bear with me a minute because these things are important. Given the device limitations, the potential amount of time it can take to obtain a sufficient oral fluid sample for both laboratory and independent testing, the Minister has tabled an amendment paper to allow drivers to choose to provide an elective oral fluid sample with sample collected at roadside if it isn't sufficient for independent testing. This has required some careful drafting of the enforcement provisions. The drafting changes introduce a number of potential pathways to allow possible future advances in device and laboratory testing technology that will enable a more streamlined approach in the future. The amendment paper amends Clause 19 to insert new Sections 71D and 71DE and set out 3 different processes following a positive first oral fluid screening test. Mr Chair, I'll seek another call if I can.
Honourable Minister.
The first is where there is sufficient oral fluid for both laboratory and private analysis so that it is obtained from the first or second screening test. No further oral sample is needed from the driver. B, the second applies where there is sufficient oral fluid for laboratory analysis but not the private analysis. In this case, the driver will have the option of providing an elective oral fluid sample for possible future private analysis at their own expense. The person will have up to 10 minutes to decide whether to provide the selective sample. The third is where the first or second oral fluid screening test do not provide an oral fluid sample sufficient for laboratory analysis. The person who provides one or more samples for laboratory analysis and can opt to provide an elective oral fluid sample. The bill provides that enforcement officer may apply the applicable process after the first oral fluid test or after the second oral fluid screening test. This is intended to provide as much flexibility as possible for the New Zealand Police to implement the regime to the most sensible way, depending on the screening technology used. For this reason, the legislation also does not prescribe how many oral fluid samples are required for the new regime. This will depend on the screening devices and laboratory services used when the regime is implemented. Section 71E, inserted in the Act by Clause 20, provides that a person who is unable to provide an oral fluid sample that is sufficient to carry out an oral fluid screening test or sufficient to carry out laboratory analysis following a positive first oral fluid screening test may be required to provide a blood sample. If a person is unable to provide a sufficient elective oral fluid sample, they won't be able to request independent analysis if they are tested, if they are issued an infringement notice after positive laboratory test results. I hope that will clarify some of the provisions within Part 2. Thank you.
Mr Tangi Utikere.
Kia ora, Mr Chair. Thank you to the Minister for providing a top-level sort of response at the start of this part. On this side, we agree with him that this is the part that is the most, the most substantial. So we do have a number of questions, and obviously there are some amendment papers from us that are there as well. Mr Chair, I want to turn to Clause 11. One of the real difficulties that the Select Committee had, and it is contained in its report, was this issue around how long someone could reasonably be expected to be effectively detained on the roadside for the purposes of an oral fluid screening test. and it was something that we sought to get some advice on. The advice, for a number of reasons, was not as easily forthcoming as perhaps some members would have liked. So this is in response to the Attorney-General raising two matters of concern, and it's the one around arbitrary detention that I want to ask the Minister about. It is very clear in the Attorney-General's report that she has formed the view that there is a real risk of arbitrary detention. It's at paragraph 62 of her report on this matter. But she basically says that there is that risk in her view where an initial oral fluid screening test takes in excess of 15 minutes, or where an individual is unable to provide what is to be known as sufficient oral fluid sample, and instead must then go down the track that the Minister has touched on, that's the blood sample. Given that she has indicated anything beyond 15 minutes is considered a risk of arbitrary detention, and in the following paragraph she identifies that in her view there are no safeguards in this bill to address that concern. My question to the Minister is whether he or his government are seeking to amend that, because I do not see that listed in any of the amendment papers that have been tabled by the government. There is one in my name, and I'd be interested to hear the Minister's thoughts on that, because this is something that Labor members certainly have quite an issue with. That if we think about this is meant to be random, and we've been given guarantees that it will be a random form of roadside testing, that anyone, anytime, can basically be come across a random checkpoint at any time of the day on New Zealand's roads, and the possibility is that they could, under the current bill as drafted, be detained for a huge period of time. Now, we have the Attorney-General saying that anything beyond 15 minutes is a real risk of arbitrary detention, and that there are no safeguards in this bill. There is only one piece of legislation in this country where there is a time limit in relation to land transport matters, and it is 15 minutes, and it's for the police to basically obtain information to seek confirmation of the identity of an individual. They've got 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, the individual is free to go. Why is there no safeguards being proposed by this government when this bill, if passed, is enacted, to mitigate the concerns that have directly been effectively identified by the Attorney-General? So in order to do that, sir, the amendment paper in my name is one that will provide actually not 15 minutes but 20 minutes. And this is something that the Select Committee did hear from in terms of grapple with as well. And the reason why the amendment paper has a period not exceeding 20 minutes is simply because the advice that was that was offered was unable to provide any information around that. There was some suggestion that there were other jurisdictions in Victoria that would have differing amounts of time as well. And so my first question is how the government is seeking to mitigate the real concerns and risks that have been identified by the Attorney-General, and whether the government is prepared to support an amendment that will basically ensure that there are protections for people in this country who are going about their lawful business, that they won't expect to be arbitrarily detained for a period in excess of 20 minutes. That's my first question.
The Honourable Julian Gento.
Chair, I really appreciate the explanation that the Minister and the Chair gave us at the beginning of this part. I mean, this is a very substantial part of the bill, so hoping to be able to canvass a few different areas. And I'm going to start with Clause 22, which introduces a new Section 71G. This is some pretty substantive changes from the original legislation, and it's about the approval of oral fluid screening devices. In Clause 71, well, the new 71G subclause 2A1, it does make it very clear that a device can be approved if it only has one or more qualifying drugs, and the process around the decision-making for the Minister of police is changed. So instead of being satisfied that the test can meet a certain threshold, it's now they just must consider certain thresholds. And I guess the question that I have is whether how the government and the minister approving the devices will be certain that the devices are accurate enough with these changes. And again, I've previously referred to the Attorney General report. There is a real risk of arbitrary detention because of the time frame, but there's also a real risk around the error rate of the oral testing devices. Is this going to be, because it's not really specified, because of the changes in the bill, in this amendment paper to the original legislation, it's no longer the case that the minister is going to be satisfied that the tests meet a reasonable threshold of accuracy. They just need to consider and balance up the different accuracy in this new section 71G, which is in clause 22, part 2. So what work is the government going to do to safeguard against unreasonably high rates of inaccuracy with the oral fluid testing devices? What recourse will people of New Zealand have if oral fluid testing devices are approved that are found to have very high rates of inaccuracy, or take such a long time that people are detained, assuming that the government's not going to support my colleague Mr. Aotearoa's amendment paper, which I think is a good idea, and we will certainly be supporting that amendment paper. So I guess what will be the follow-up, given that now we can approve devices that we can't be assured ahead of time have the right accuracy, but will the government have a monitoring program? Will that be funded? Will there be regular reporting on accuracy rates of the devices used? If they do procure devices which are found to have unreasonably high inaccuracy rates, will they switch to a different oral fluid testing device? I can understand why in the legislation they've loosened it up because it was too hard to procure the right devices. But I think the point is that you want devices that are accurate and that are not taking too long and that are actually delivering the results so that we can have the deterrence effect and have the road safety outcomes that we all want. But if the devices aren't doing that, what is the recourse? How is the government going to be assured?
Mr.
Chair. Just in answer to Mr. Aotearoa's amendment paper and the government position on that, we will not be supporting that. We do understand the valid reasons that he's put this out. We don't want to be impeding citizens unnecessarily. The Auditor General has made some commentary around that, but there is some practicalities around this. This is not as seamless as an alcohol breath test. We are dealing with emerging technologies, to Ms Jenner's point, evolving as to how we address what we all, or most of us in the House, agree is a very real issue. We want to be able to stop people that are driving around impaired. So it is a point, it is a perfect is the enemy of good here. We do need to get a regime in place. We will be looking to best practice around the world, and the provisions in the bill do provide for that. The reason we don't support the a 20-minute cut-off as proposed in the amendment paper, because it does take some time for these devices to return a result. There is some issues in how cooperative a driver might be, and we did hear, actually, we understand the Select Committee undertook these tests. We heard Arena Williams describe the process last night, and one of the members in the committee was unable to provide a test. I believe it might have even been my own colleague, Andy Foster, who I was a little bit alarmed to hear this about. He seems like he's okay, so that's the good news. So there is some actual practical reasons why this might take a period of time. And the other part to that is if someone actually genuinely is pulled over and is genuinely impaired, if there is a 20-minute cut-off as proposed in the amendment paper, that's a stop clock. You can play for time. You can the police can, as indicated, if you've got a driver that's not cooperative or refuses to give the sufficient volume of sample, even if they were able to. So there's a chance there that the system would be gamed, and if someone was pulled, it's quite likely that would be the case. So 20 minutes, we don't support that. We do think there needs to be operational discretion from the police. We do have confidence in the police that they will roll this out in an appropriate manner.
Cameron Luxon.
I have, following on from, thank you, Minister, for those answers. It's interesting, the conversation in the Select Committee did touch on whether there should be a legislative time restraint to really take to account the serious concerns which were raised in the Section 7 report from the Attorney General. ACT is rather concerned about the civil liberties aspects of this bill, Mr Chair. So I would like to hear some answers from the Minister to a couple of concerns which I have, and I also have some further after this contribution. One of them, Minister, is you've defined, a stop clock. If you set a time limit, we'll end up with a stop clock. I mean, the Land Transport Act, I think it's Section 114 of the Land Transport Act, says you're only allowed to stop a driver for 15 minutes without cause before needing to move to another piece of legislation or another contributing factor. So if you suspect them of something else, you can move to another piece of legislation. What did the government, did the Minister think about maybe having say a 15 or a 20, as Mr Aotearoa has proposed, a 20-minute time, and then having an automatic progression as in a mandatory some kind of sample. Was there any, did you look into that in any way, Minister? Because I think that would negate the stop clock, because who's really going to try and play for time if they know as soon as that time runs out, the police officer who has that person stopped can use suspicion of cause to go on to another process. So I think that is an issue that I'd like to hear the Minister's comment on. The other issue that came up in Select Committee, and I'm less concerned about this after the discussion with the police, but it is still a concern that I'd like even just to have the Minister on record saying what he would and would not expect to happen in the real world. And that is the Section 59, failure or refusal to remain in a specified place or to accompany an enforcement officer. We had advice in the committee that this would be used only for, as an example, moving a driver from a somewhat unsafe, dangerous, maybe on the road position to a shoulder, a berm off the road, just so that there is a safer place to actually conduct one of these tests. But I'm a little bit concerned, Mr Chair, that there isn't a limit on how far that can go. How far can an officer take somebody with them required to accompany enforcement officer? Would that be, say, I've pulled this person over as a police officer, I've pulled this person over, I don't have the test with me, but I think I'd like to do a random test. You'll need to now accompany me to the station, 20 minutes, 50 k's down the road. Our rural communities wouldn't want to be going through that, as the Minister can, I'm sure, empathise as the Minister for rural communities. We don't want to be having look, let's be fair, but police, they do great work, but they are humans, and we don't want to have issues arise where there's a gap in the law that could be exploited in that sort of position. So I'd like to hear on that accompany an officer, and I'd also like to hear the Minister really answer the question I've just proposed about having a next step after a cut-off, rather than just having, as it was described just now, a target for a person of ill motivation to try and get to avoid doing a random fluid roadside screening oral fluid test. And that also, Mr. Chair, I'd just like to make the point, this is for the first test. This is a screening test. It is the first test which somebody does. We should not be expecting this to be taking 20 minutes. And I think for future, when people are looking back on, when courts or others are looking back on what's happened in this House today, I think they would like to see something from the executive, something from the minister saying, look, if I saw a case of 20 minutes, I would be seriously concerned. Something along those lines, Minister, just to give some guidance to future New Zealanders looking back on what we're doing here today. Thank you.
Dr. Lawrence Sunan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually have a similar point to the previous speaker, Cameron Luxon, around a particular point, and this is section 10, subsection 5, and it's basically says, after section 59.2, insert new section 3, subsection 3, and I'm looking at subsection 3b, which is when a person commits an infringement offense if the person fails or refuses to accompany without delay an enforcement officer. Now, I know that there might be other people who would like to ask more around the questions of enforcement officer, but my first question, and also just signaling to the chair that there are a lot of subparts to part 2, and I will personally be looking at doing it methodologically from subpart 1 to subpart 6. But I think on this subpart 1, for this particular question, I know there are other people who might be more interested in terms of some of the conditions and circumstances around enforcement officer, but my question is around the power that is being granted to an enforcement officer to be able to issue the infringement notice if a person fails or refuses to accompany without delay. Now, I am sure that the Minister is aware of the obiter dictum that was part of the landmark case of Taylor and New Zealand Poultry Farm in 1984 through the Court of Appeal. So in that particular instance, just for context, essentially it was a person who had a car full of thousands of eggs, and was stopped by the police actually the poultry farm officer on multiple occasions, where they are asked about where your eggs came from, and the person refused to answer, was issued with the infringement notice as well as a $700 fine. This went up all the way, it came from a chicken, but where is that chicken from? But anyway, the point is that that particular thing went all up to the Court of Appeal, and it became a fundamental question around a person's privilege and in terms of compliance with the Bill of Rights. Now, I had a look at the Bill of Rights report, particularly Section 7 report, and I'm a little bit alarmed that neither Section 23.4, 25D, and 27.1 were a part of that report. And I think in this case, it is absolutely vital that we address those 3 particular clauses, because it all comes down to a person's privilege against self-incrimination. The reason I raised that case, and I want to mention in this point, is for a person to have to commit an infringement notice if they fail or refuse to accompany without delay, because they refuse to accompany on the basis that what they will need to do when they are accompanying the enforcement officer will be subject to self-incrimination. That is quite a serious Bora test, and that's quite a serious right in terms of the fundamental right that we have as people, as members, and as people of Aotearoa. Now, the reason that case was so important and why we are seeing it again here is on the basis that there is a general concern around a person's liberty and being able to travel freely and be able to not self-incriminate in these sort of situations. And there was a general concern as part of that case around the fact that we are looking at too much power being granted to the executive, or in this case to enforcement officers, to be undertaking such.
Could you just repeat the case again?
Yep, it is Taylor and New Zealand Poultry Board. It is a Court of Appeal case from 1984. What? we are the legislature. Of course, we're going to be mentioning case law that are pertinent to the way that we make bills, because it's one of the things that, particularly for the committee stage with Hansard, I mean, the member will understand that, with Hansard, when lawyers are taking certain cases to the court, or if anyone challenges this bill on a matter of fact and a matter of privilege against one's privilege against self-incrimination, they will be going through the Hansard and they'll be looking at the ministerial intent as part of the statutory interpretation process, which I'm sure that member is well aware of. So, yes, please do, because it is quite an exciting case. I would highly recommend any member who haven't seen the case or haven't read that case brief to go and have a look. But the point here is that what is the power being granted to an enforcement officer under Section 10?
Mr. Chair.
Oh, sorry.
Honourable Mark Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will take on a couple of the points that have been raised. I know everyone wants to get to the Taylor versus New Zealand Poultry Board case, but I will deal with the Julianne Genter's points around the approving devices and the accuracy of devices. We know that the test now, the screening tests are about 95% accurate, and the laboratory tests are almost 100% accurate. Only human error can. So there is quite a lot of. There's a high degree of accuracy there. So. An infringement is only found on the basis of the laboratory testing. A positive result at the roadside triggers that laboratory analysis, and we expect police to monitor the effectiveness of those devices over time as technology overseas and similar jurisdictions evolve. So we have provisioned for that in the bill, and we've discussed that earlier on in these deliberations. To the points that Cameron Luxton and Lawrence Sunan have, in substance, raising the same issue. I must say on the Taylor versus the New Zealand Poultry Board, it's discussed regularly at the Coach and Horses on a Friday night. It is seared in the consciousness of rural New Zealand. So essentially the civil liberties element, the failure to remain in place or accompany an officer, how far can an officer take a driver? Those questions that came from, or the substantive of the questions that came from Mr. Luxton and Mr. Sunan. There are existing powers that the police have operationalised within the alcohol enforcement laws, and we expect that the police will conduct themselves in exactly the same way with the drug testing as they do with the alcohol provisions on those matters.
Dr. Lawrence Sunan.
Thank you for that response, Minister. But I think that doesn't actually reassure, I know it doesn't reassure myself. I don't know if Mr. Cameron Luxton would have other thoughts around this. Yes, it is true that under the primary legislation, or including this amendment bill, that enforcement officers would have the power to do that. But again, it comes down to the fact of the lack of specificity, or unless there is a specific secondary legislation that is going to be, that would be specifying the powers that are granted to an enforcement officer. And the reason I mentioned about this level of specificity is when it comes to something as important as our Bill of Rights, often when it does get challenged in a court of law, it favors the side that did not draft the bill, or it also favors the side that it doesn't favor the side that doesn't have any level of specificity. So this is one of the things why I raise that particular case, is because as we see from subsequent case laws as a result of the case that I just mentioned, and as well as the comment that was made as part of the obiter dictum in that particular case, what I'm curious and I guess and also a slight concern is that what we are seeing here is that by granting and by not having that level of reassurance around the testing itself and having enforcement officers granting those power, what we might actually see is more people being able to challenge the enforcement officer or the relevant enforcement agency on the matter of privilege and on the matter of privilege against self-incrimination because of the fact that there isn't a level of specificity that comes down to the extent of the power granted to enforcement officer. So it was mainly a question of when it comes to enforcement officer, I understand that both the primary legislation as well as this bill may confer certain powers, but what those powers extend to, does it extend to, for example, we've seen that enforcement officer being able to detain. Does it extend to the enforcement officer being able to issue a fine? What are the limitations of that fine? What are the ways that the person who the infringement offense would be able to, receive that orally or by writing? I mean, again, the more specific that we make the legislation, the less chances it will be for people to be able to challenge that. Because of the fact that it is all laid out in a high degree of detail. So that was mainly in response to what the minister said. And again, I appreciate the minister answering the questions that those powers are conferred within the primary legislation. But I just want some clarity around whether there will be additional notices provided or additional secondary legislation created by order of council that allows us to see that in the context of this bill that is addressed. Because again, I hear what the minister is saying in terms of the high degree of accuracy and etc. But again, the difference that we're seeing with this bill in the context that it is not about drink driving, it's about drug driving. Drink driving, we're looking at, possibly, correct me if I'm wrong, we're looking at one specific compound, which is ethanol, whereas with drug driving, we're looking at a whole myriad of different potential compounds, different levels, and again, it comes down to the idea that, yes, there is the level of accuracy, but different people have different pharmacological effect as a part of that. And, the first pass effect in terms of how your liver functions, it all factors into that. So in sense, there is this, potentially there's this sense of unconscious bias, which is why I was asking the minister before about pharmacological effect. So in the context of this, it was just some clarifications around whether there will be other secondary legislations as a result of this particular bill that's introduced.
Mr. Chair. Thank you. I take my first call on this particular bill. And just after the last speaker's presentation to the House, it gives another meaning to fried in regards to the land transport drug driving. We should put fried in there, just because he's brought up the eggs in his speech. But look, I just want to make a short contribution to this, Minister, and I'm looking forward to your contribution to the questions that I have and the concerns that I have in regard to this bill. And I will touch on Part 2, Section 59, 10 and 11, Section A, in terms of the powers of enforcement officers. And as we know, and if we follow the data, it's 4 times likely, Māori are 4 times likely to receive a conviction for drug possession. And how far does the testing go in terms of the powers of an enforcement officer? Are we just testing for what appears to be somebody who is under the influence? Or does it allow then for the fishing expedition of that particular person who has been pulled over? And I don't see anything in the legislation that isolates this as just an isolated case. And if we look at the data, also that Māori men are more likely to be stopped, tasered, and prosecuted by the police due to bias and structural racism. And that was a report that came out, and the name of the report is Understanding Police Delivery. And that's based on, and Māori men are stopped because of their, and in the report actually talks about their physical appearance, their size, their gender, their age, and the perception of aggressive behaviour, perception. Now, some people, their perception of aggressive behaviour, or even to be intimidated, Could be somebody wearing gang regalia, and that's not a public place in a vehicle, right? That's a private vehicle. And so some people deem that as that, and we've seen legislation be moved in this House to that fact. And so I have concerns about the particular sections that I have mentioned, the powers of enforcement officers, because of the data and the many reports that have been presented and that have been done, and the structural racism and bias that continues to go towards Māori in this particular fashion. So I do have concerns in regards to that. I don't see any protective measures put in place. I do like the amendment proposed by Member Aotearoa. You don't want people there all day. And so as this bill goes through and the amendments, we debate the amendments, I do think there should be some protective measures. There are no protective measures in here. There are no protective measures. And how far can the powers of the enforcement officer go? Are we just testing, or are we then going to search the vehicles? Are we then going to search the person? Because then the implications of that means that other parts of the law, other laws then kick in. And again, supports the report Understanding Police Delivery of their bias and structural racism. That's a fact. And so these are the questions that I ask of the Minister. What protective measures does this piece of legislation have in place to ensure that there isn't the bias, that there isn't the structural racism, that the report, in terms of its findings, doesn't stereotype Māori because of their physical appearance, size, gender, age, and the perception of aggressive behaviour? Those are the questions that I have for the Minister, and I look forward to his answers. Kia ora tata.
Mr. Tarangi.
Kia ora, Mr. Speaker, thank you. I am disappointed to learn that some parties might be seeking to adopt a position that effectively provides restrictions on the free movement and liberty of people of this country, or anyone actually who's driving a motor vehicle. And Mr. Waititi identifies the lack of protective measures, which is in line with what the Attorney General has identified as well, and is a position that we take on this side of the House in leading to some of those amendment papers. I have to signal the real concern that we would have if there was nothing put in this bill to address the specific concerns that the Attorney General has raised. Because as it stands, I actually like the term of the foster clause actually that Minister Patterson referred to, because what it identifies is someone who perhaps has is in a circumstance who has an inability to legitimately not provide a suitable sample, that they would be able to be detained, anyone that would be able to be detained for an indefinite period of time. Mr. Luxton has identified concerns that are very real. I mean, we expect that people are able to move around this country on our roads without any unfair limitation. Now, everyone accepts that when you rock on up to a alcohol breath screening point, you accept that that is going to perhaps for some be a mild inconvenience. You do not expect to be waiting there for 20 minutes for a screening test. You know, it's a matter of seconds, right? I think most people in this House would have experienced an alcohol breath screening test. Very, very simple, some impediment, but not in excess of 20 minutes. And so I don't think it's unreasonable for this to have a protective measure that actually is in excess of the only other time limit that exists in land transport legislation, which is 15 minutes. And if we have a look at the amendment paper for the benefit of other members of the House, what it seeks to do is a person required to remain stopped on a road for as long as is reasonably necessary to enable the officer to administer an oral fluid screening test cannot be required to remain stopped for a period that exceeds 20 minutes. Members might ask, well, when would the 20 minutes actually commence? Well, we've got an answer for you. It's the next one that comes. Clause 1B, the 20-minute period contained in the subsection commences when an enforcement officer informs the driver of the requirement to undertake an oral fluid screening test, which would be the initial one. The moment that an enforcement officer informs the driver that there is a requirement for them to undertake an oral fluid screening test, that is the very first one. From that point, the 20 minutes starts. It doesn't start from the moment that a vehicle has stopped waiting in a queue, as we have all experienced. The clock would start the moment the enforcement officer is effectively informing the driver as the reason as to why they are stopped in the requirement to undertake the oral fluid screening test. So we don't think that is unreasonable. Now, there has been a suggestion that, well, drivers would be able to game the system. The good thing about this legislation is that it actually provides flexibility around the compulsory impairment test. Currently, police are restricted as to when they can engage that CIT. This provides much flexibility to the police to actually divert when they need to engage that. If they have real cause that there is impairment, then they can go down there. Now, we will come to the CIT later on, sir, because there are particular things that need to happen with that. But I have real concerns that the Parliament would allow to go through this change in legislation that effectively would allow for citizens, residents, visitors going about their normal business to be detained for a period in excess of 20 minutes. In excess of 20 minutes. Now, I think, we hear about the changing technologies, all those sorts of stuff, that there are practical reasons. Do not roll this out until those issues are sorted. The procurement of devices, how that works, needs to be sorted, and it needs to not limit the movement, the reasonable movement of citizens beyond a period of 20 minutes. So I asked the Minister and the Chair as to why he thinks that it is appropriate to have limitations to that extent.
The Honourable James Maker.
Oh, Mr. Chair, thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I thought I'd just address a couple of questions that are a bit of a hangover from last night. One of them was from Julianne Genter. Ms. Genter asked about a question around fatal crashes and some evidence around that. And I'm advised that the provisions in the bill are intended to improve the detection and deterrence of drug driving on our roads. Of course, the impact at this stage in New Zealand is unknown because we've never done this before. But the officials will be closely, and police and the ministry will be closely monitoring deaths and serious injuries where a driver involved in the crash had consumed impairing drugs. And we know from statistics that 1 in 3 deaths on our road is influenced by this kind of behaviour. So we would assume that any impaired driving or driving under the influence we can take off the road would have some impact, but it awaits to be seen because we actually have to introduce the measures first before we can undertake the testing. Second question from Ms. Genter was, will it be possible that the drivers know the substances that the oral fluid test will be testing for at the time they are in operation? The answer to that is yes. The bill does require the Police Minister to approve the oral fluid screening devices by notice, and that notice must specify the qualifying drugs or families of drugs that the devices will be used to detect and the concentration level of the drug or drugs that will return a positive result. There were some further questions last night from Lawrence Shunan. Mr. Shunan, after his Bora questions and Benzo questions, asked, do we think the tests are reliable enough or accurate enough to warrant limitation under Bora? Yes, we do. The devices are about 95% accurate in correctly detecting the presence of some drugs, although there is some variation and there is some recourse beyond that. To address the issue, the regime does require 2 positive tests at the roadside before a person is stood down for 12 hours and a positive laboratory test before an infringement notice is issued. We think that's adequate and sufficient protection in place. And just finally, there's the amendment paper from Tangi Tikeri around amending new sections 71G3 and 71G(a)(2). We don't support these amendments. The sections require the Police Minister to consult the Minister of Transport and Science Minister. If the Police Minister considers it appropriate to do that, they can do it. There's no need for the bill to provide mandatory consultation for this discretionary action.
Tom Rutherford.
And on this question now close.
The Honourable Julianne Genter.
Mr. Chair, thank you. And I really thank the Minister and the Chair for his answers to my questions yesterday. There is a follow-up question from what the Minister just said, that so the Minister of Police will be required to let people know which substances will be tested for in the oral fluid devices. My understanding from the Select Committee is that it's unlikely that they would be testing for more than 2 or 3 substances at one time, because it would increase, like, the more substances you're testing for, the longer it takes to get a result. And we have been in this section, in this part 2, talking about the issues around the length of time that drivers might be detained. So I guess the question that flows from the answers that the Minister just gave is, if drivers know that certain substances will be tested for, it's also the case that a whole lot of dozens of other substances won't be tested for. And what is to stop people from switching the substance, so maybe they're using less of the substance that's being tested for, but still using other impairing substances that won't be tested for? And how can we have the policy objective of deterring people from driving impaired if we're only testing for 2 or 3 substances and drivers know what those are, when we know there's many, many more substances that can impair driving? So I guess it's just a question around what is the government going to do about the fact that they can only test for a few substances at one time? There's many, many impairing substances that presumably are represented in the statistics the Minister made reference to. And then otherwise in this part, I guess the other question is, will the government be seeking to have to test for more substances, maybe 6? I don't think you can test for more than 6. And what, I guess, if the more substances that are in the devices that are procured, the longer the wait time to get a result. And I think this does, again, question whether, because the Attorney General did mention there's real risk of arbitrary detention that will increase if you're testing for more substances. So it would be great if the Minister did have an answer to that, although I appreciate the answers that the Minister has given so far. And I mean, we've only really covered a few of the subparts in Part 2, so I'm expecting, Mr. Chair, that we'll be able to drill down into the detail of further subparts after this.
Mr. Chair. Honourable James Mager.
Mr. Chair, just to quickly address those questions from the member, of course, we don't test for any substances now, so any addition to that process will be a good start, and I think we could always look at adding more substances later on if the member encouraged us to do so. I'm aware that we've already covered this off in the previous part, so I don't want to labour those issues too much longer, I think, as we are now in Part 2. There was a question there from Mr. Waititi about the protective measures the bill has against bias and discrimination. The bill does enable enforcement officers to stop any driver to administer oral fluid screening tests without the need to suspect. That's an important part of the regime. It's an important component so that there are no, unreasonable factors preventing police from doing that. But I mean, police can do that generally. There's unlike other jurisdictions around the world, there are no reasons police need to provide for stopping a driver. There are a whole range of things that police stop drivers for. We're primarily concerned about stopping harmful behaviour on the road. Police will consider issues raised when operating the regime, but of course we've got utmost faith that our police operate with integrity, and we have high confidence in our police, the men and women of the New Zealand Police Force, that they will treat every individual that they come across with the dignity and respect they deserve, regardless of what they look like. That's the expectation of this government, that we treat people as individuals and we don't treat people by the colour of the skin, but rather we acknowledge the content of their character, so to speak, and we treat everyone equally. That's the expectation that the government applies to government agencies, and that's the expectation that we would apply to the police as well. And just I wanted to touch on Mr. Aotearoa's amendment paper around timing. I think the previous minister's already addressed some of the answers to the questions around that, so I won't labour it too much longer, but I understand that specifying a timeframe in legislation may incentivise drivers to prolong the process to avoid undergoing a screening test, which would undermine the effectiveness of the regime. I think the previous ministers mentioned that before, so we don't need to go into it too much longer. And then finally, there was a comment there about it being needing to be very cautious about restricting people's movements, and particularly in vehicles. And of course, we agree. We agree that those limitations on free movement around the country should only be done for very, very important reasons. We think that the prevention of death and injury on the roads due to impairment is a very important reason. And like the previous government, who took significant steps to stop individuals travelling around the country for very good health reasons, we think this is a very good law and order reason and health reason to put some minor preventions in place to stop those people driving on our roads and causing horrific harm and injury to innocent New Zealanders going about their everyday business.
Dr. Lawrence Zidane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, I just want to signal to Mr. Chair that this is the substantial portion of this bill with 20 pages and 8 subparts. And it is also a bill that has a Section 7 report, which then deserves greater scrutiny. So we are still, Mr. Chair, been kind of taking things methodologically and moving through from one subpart to another. And we're still very much, there's still very much to say about this particular bill, despite the fact that Minister may suggest that some of them have been covered under the previous part. But I also want to signal to the Minister that there are some very specific clauses that we would like to address as part of Part 2. The first question, I think, to the Minister, kind of in response to what the Minister has said, I think that fundamentally, based on the police independent report from August last year, it signals that the police themselves, as well as the independent report, suggests that there is a level of bias when we're looking at basically stopping people to administer that drug test. I agree with the previous minister in the chair to say that yes, the test itself doesn't discriminate, but the way that the people who are being waved down or being stopped very much has a level of bias, particularly towards Māori, ethnic communities and disabled whānau. And that is precisely the question that the independent report from August 2024 last year, if you haven't seen it, have a look. It's really enlightening. But this very much answers the question, also supports the question that that our colleague from Te Pāti Māori, Rawiri, Waitite was asking as well regarding some of that bias. My question to the Minister is on Section 12, the subsection 3, and the newly replaced Section 64(6). Now, it does say that the element of defense is something that is incredibly important for people to have as a part of this whole process. Again, the element of someone to have that level of defense is incredibly important when we're looking at certain rights that are being restricted as a result of this bill. I am interested to know why that element of defense that has been corrected only talks about error in terms of the proportion of a qualifying drug, but unlike the previous definition of a qualifying drug, it doesn't take into consideration the pharmacological effects of that drug. So would pharmacological effect be considered as an aspect of an error, or that doesn't prevent someone from having that defense, or is it just simply in terms of the proportionality itself? I know that I've also held back on a number of questions around the determination of the qualifying drug. I think that is coming up later when we're looking at further into subpart 6, 7, 8. But I also want to raise the fact that what we are also seeing here is one major amendment paper that has been dropped by the government as part of this process that didn't go through the Select Committee and potentially addresses some of the issues and concerns that the Select Committee raised. But then we also see the new amendment paper that is being dropped by the Honourable Chris Bishop in terms of clause 16. So I think I'll move on to that particular clause. So this is subpart 6, clause 16, subclause 5, replace section 71A 7 to 9, and I'm looking at replacement section 71A 8, Roman numeral 2A. And also this is in conjunction with the Honourable Chris Bishop's amendment paper number 257. I wanted to check with the Minister that we are seeing that capital A here may be issued with an infringement notice has been removed as part of the Honourable Chris Bishop's amendment. And I wanted to check with the Minister if that was partly to do with the fact that what you have is that a situation where the person who provided or who has a positive oral fluid sample should not be issued with an infringement notice before they have a chance to provide a level of defense when it comes to being allowed a private analyst to analyze that sample at the same time. But I think one of the things I want to check with the rationale behind the removal of capital A of that particular subclause. But the second question I have for the Minister is, what sort of analysis is being done that at the person's own expense isn't going to disadvantage people from lower socioeconomic areas that they do not have the money or the resources to be able to pay for their own tests at their own expense?
Honourable Transmaker. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to quickly address one of the points the member who just took a seat raised around bias. I think we've well and truly covered this topic. We have the utmost faith in the New Zealand Police that they will treat everyone fairly and equally, and I think to continue to labour the point might border on repetitive, and I wouldn't want that to be something that the member engages in this debate, because we love fresh content and new questions, and repetitive questions obviously are not something that I'm overly interested in either. And just in terms of Ms Genta's question from before that I partially answered, I just wanted to make sure I give a full answer. This is around what is deterring drivers from switching to using substances not currently tested for. The devices do only test for the defined list of qualifying drugs. They will be kept under review. But also just note that if a police officer does suspect a driver has consumed a drug and is impaired, the officer can require the driver to undergo a compulsory impairment test.
Chair, I'd like to have some clarification in relation to giving blood under Part 2. So in situations, Section 72 of the changes talk about when you are taking either blood or saliva from somebody. What would happen in the instance, I'm interested in parts of rural New Zealand where the officer and the person pulled over may be some distance from a place where bloods can be taken or where the secondary, where an extra test can be done. And even with the fact of if the person isn't able to drive their car, so if they've done 2 saliva tests, both are proving to be positive, the car is then unable to be driven by that person, but the lab test still has not come back. In situations like that, what happens with the vehicle a long distance from a police station or a tow truck driver? I'm assuming that the police officer would be able to escort the driver who can no longer drive back to a town or a city centre, or assist them to be able to call a taxi or an Uber, I'm assuming, if there's one available. But if the car is then left at the side of the road, is it then the responsibility of that driver to have the car towed or to find other ways? Where does that responsibility lie? And my point comes, Mr. Chair, because if those 2 tests, which have tested positive through the saliva test, then come back to not showing to be confirmed through a lab test, then is it fair that the driver of the vehicle is then required to pay for the towing or taxi or Uber fares for themselves when the lab test has proven that there is no conclusive evidence that a prohibited substance was detected in that final test? And further to that, Mr. Chair, it would be also really helpful to know that in situations where someone refuses to take a test at the side, I understand that incurs a penalty, but it would be of interest to know what if they change their mind? Are they able to change their mind down the track? So if they refuse and they get the penalty, it will just be useful, and I apologise if this has been covered, but that's an interest of me, that when you are, again, in parts of rural New Zealand, when you're on not a main state highway or away from bright lights, and you've got a single police officer who's dealing with an individual, and there are issues in terms of accessing either a police station, transport, or additional backup testing. Just wondering if there's been some consideration in the operational practicalities of how that would apply to parts of rural New Zealand.
Honourable James
Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll respond to a couple of the points raised by members. Very quick one from Lawrence Shunan. Asked why new section 7186 Roman 2A capital A was deleted. It was deleted because it repeats a matter already covered in the previous sub-paragraph, and it fixes a drafting error. So hopefully that sorts that one. The questions from the member Ginny Anderson around rural, the impact on rural New Zealand, I think they raised relatively good points. My expectation would be that we treat the situation exactly the same as how we treat drink drivers, and that is that we have zero tolerance for the harm caused by drink and drug drivers on our communities, in particular in our rural communities, where deaths on our rural roads have a significantly large and disproportionate impact on those communities, because often one death on those roads means it impacts so many families and so many communities in those areas where almost literally everyone in that road and in that community will know that person. So we take a very low risk approach to having drink drivers and drug drivers on our rural roads, and the member's very good with her maths. She can do the calculations of the likelihood of 2 false positives. It's very, very low, and on the case where there are 2 false positives and a laboratory test comes back with a negative, that may well cause some inconvenience or some issues with those individuals that are picked up. But the likelihood of that happening is very, very low, and it's worth the trade-off for us in order to reduce and eliminate the risk of drug drivers and drink drivers on our rural roads who cause havoc, cause chaos, destroy families, rip communities apart. That's not what we stand for on this side of the House, so that's why we're progressing with this part of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, I know the Minister is a new Minister, but he has yet to address the second point that the Attorney-General has raised as a concern. Now, there has been some conversation about the arbitrary detention point, but delving into the unreasonable search and seizure point that the Attorney-General has raised in her report is something that the government really do need to respond to. Now, this hangs on the taking of saliva from or the requirement for someone to provide saliva on the roadside. But further than that, Madam Chair, is the taking of blood, because there will be circumstances where there will be a requirement for someone to have their blood taken. And that is where someone effectively fails, with all good intent and reason, to be able to provide an adequate sample. Is it correct, Minister, that the only option available to that person then would be to provide a sample of blood, effectively forcing them into that position? He's nodding his head, so maybe that is not the case, that there was, for someone who is unable to provide 2 samples, oral fluid samples, is it correct that the only option for them then would be to go and have their blood taken? Of course, they could refuse to do that, but in terms of taking a sample for the purposes of checking or having it analysed, is that the case? Someone who is wishing to comply with all requests, a situation where they provide the saliva but it's just not able to provide the reading or analysis on the roadside, what are the options available to them? That is the first question. Second question is, when it comes to the blood test fee, could the Minister please provide some response to the committee around who meets that cost? Because I think the bill is silent, in which case it might then fall on the police or on the Crown to meet that cost. But the Minister Bishop has introduced an amendment paper that changes the election of a private individual to go and have the oral fluid analysed, and that's at the person's individual cost. I understand that, that's a change. Two things on that though. One is if the private analysis comes back to indicate that actually no, it was not a positive reading, is that money for the fee somehow reimbursed or returned to the individual? The other part of that for the Minister is in a circumstance where one qualifying drug or family of qualifying drugs is detected upon analysis, but a private analysis is elected and taken through and it comes up with a different response to a different qualifying drug or family of drugs. What is the situation of the infringement there? Does it still stand, or does it relate purely to the original family or qualifying drug that was tested for and returned a positive result for? The other question that I have is related to Clause 16, Subclause 8B2. And that talks about if the analysis establishes that the sample is positive, the person may be issued with an infringement notice. Can the Minister provide a response as to why it is may and why it is not will? Are there circumstances where an infringement may not follow, and what are those circumstances within which that infringement will not follow? So I'm happy to give the Minister the reference. Again, that's Clause 16, Subclause 8B2. The other question that I have, and given, Madam Chair, what has been signalled is that this is the substantive part of the bill, and there are many other clauses that I wish to touch on that have not been touched on yet. But one that I am interested in from the Minister is in relation to Clause 17, the new section 1A(b)(1). This is about the requirement to accompany the enforcement officer to a place. It has already been raised by a couple of members today, including Mr Luxton. There is a distinct difference around booze buses in their locality vis-a-vis what is unknown technologies at this stage for the rollout. So are there any parameters around what that place would be defined as? Is, for example, there a requirement as to how far a distance or limitations on distance, particularly if you are travelling with, family members or others who would basically have to remain in situ in the vehicle whilst that work is undertaken?
Madam
Honourable
Chair.
James Meager.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to address the question from Lawrence Shunan around Clause 12, amending Section 64, asked to explain the amendments. The amendment maintains the existing defence provisions. It replaces the use of oral fluid tests with oral fluid screening tests to acknowledge the change in the use of devices. And that helps clarify that prosecutions regarding offences for drugs in the blood are not affected by the results of a roadside screening test. And just to address the first part of Mr Aotearoa's questions, who is relitigating the Bora arguments that we've gone over a couple of times previously, in fact twice last night. So I'll repeat it again in case Mr Aotearoa wasn't there to hear it. Well, it is very important. Well, you're going and at the risk of not wanting to
I'd like to hear the Minister's answer, please.
Not wanting to provide a legal opinion while there are distinguished professors in the chamber who no doubt could offer much more insightful views than mine. The Bora tests require us to satisfy a number of aspects. We on this side of the House think that this is a sufficiently important purpose, which is protecting New Zealanders from the risks and harm of drink and drug drivers. We think that the policy to do this, that is testing those individuals for the presence of drugs in their system to prevent them from driving, is sufficiently connected to preventing that harm. We think that there are no other ways or minimal ways that we could implement this policy. We think this is pretty much the basic level of things you could do to test for drugs in the system to avoid those horrific accidents and horrific deaths that kill so many New Zealanders on our roads. And overall, we think it is proportional to the response. So we think that in terms of the requirement to test for those substances, we think we're in a pretty reasonable space, and we think it is a justified limit on people's rights to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. So hopefully that gives us a pretty good roundup on NZBORA. And just finally, we will come back to some of the other questions around. The one thing in there that I think, address now from Mr Aotearoa was, will people be forced to undertake blood samples? No. I understand in no legislation in this country are people required to undertake medical treatment or be provided to give blood tests. So, thank you.
Thank you. Before I take another question, and the Minister has just indicated that he's got some other answers that he will come back on, I want to hear specific questions rather than speeches. I understand Dr. Junan is going through some of the clauses, so I please don't want any repetitive questions from other parts that I've heard, and I've been watching very carefully, and I do find some of the calls are speeches and perhaps not, and I'm not referring to the member that's currently on his feet, but just in general, repetitive, and I want to hear specific questions rather than speeches. Dr. Lawrence Junan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for that. I will be signalling very clearly in terms of which section that I'm referring to, and I'm currently referring to section 22, specifically the newly introduced 70GA. But I think before that, I just want to make a note that, again, one of the things I heard before from the government members that is quite concerning is someone shouted out that Bora is boring, and I would like to raise that this is a fundamental constitutional document of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it should be by no means regarded as boring. But onto the actual section. So this partially, actually, because I didn't hear a response from any of the ministers, but it does partially answer some of my questions in terms of the threshold, and particularly the positive evidence threshold for some of the new drugs that would be, or the new qualifying drugs that would be introduced as part of that. But I have a question on this section in general. The first question is around 71GA 1, subclause 1B, it talks about for each listed qualifying drugs specify, so the Minister of Police maybe they'll specify this under secondary legislation, that the concentration level of the drug in the person. And I wanted to check, the Minister before have already mentioned that the test itself has a 95% accuracy, and two tests will have an even greater accuracy. I get that, understand that. Is the test sufficient to detect concentration level up to a particular threshold, or is the detection of 95% accuracy simply being able to detect a particular kind of drug? That hopefully is a reasonably straightforward and simple question. Now, my next question is to do with subclause 2 of that particular section, which is before making a notice, the Minister of Police must consult Minister of Transport and the Science Minister, which is understandable and fair. But the question I have is that we have mentioned and touched on that certain drugs that isn't part of the listed drug currently. So I have mentioned other compounds that are considered or have a similar chemical structure as benzodiazepine and other forms of anxiolytics. But my question is, those drugs some of them are incredibly important to people with anxiety, depression, other forms of neurodiversity. Will the Minister consider also consulting other organizations? Because my concern is just by consulting Minister of Transport and the Science Minister may not actually address the real concern that we hear from our communities, particularly from those who are suffering from, let's say, depression, anxiety, or even who are neurodivergent. So would that be a part of the consideration as part of the consultation? The last question I have is to do with 71GA, subclause 3C, which is if the positive evidence threshold does not align with the applicable threshold in relevant standards, or if there isn't any, the Minister of Police may nevertheless be satisfied. What does the Minister consider to be satisfactory in that case when there isn't an identifiable standard, either domestic or international? And I do notice that two of the standards has been highlighted in 71G, subsection 7A, in that some of the standard has been listed there. But when it doesn't align, does it mean it doesn't align because what the Minister wants is a higher threshold or a lower threshold? If he doesn't align with that, and if there isn't, what is the definition of satisfied? What are some of the criteria and some of the process that the Minister will use in consultation with the Minister of Transport and Science Minister when determining that unalignment in terms of a positive evidence threshold. So 3 questions. Does the test include concentration level? Will the minister consult with other organizations, particularly from a perspective of those with anxiolytics for those suffering from depression and anxiety? And what does unaligned mean and what does satisfied mean?
Honourable James Meagher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll address the questions from Tangi Aotearoa around why does Clause 16, new Section 71A8B, Roman 2, require an officer, provide that an officer may issue an infringement notice if a laboratory test comes back positive. The answer to that is that police have a discretion to issue infringements in all contexts, and that aligns with the standard practice of police across the board. And I'll address very quickly one of the questions raised by Mr. Shunan around whether or not neurodiversity is part of the Minister's requirements or part of the Minister's practice or intentions when he undertakes consultation. Now, I can't speak for the Minister of Police, but I am aware that the Minister of Police is a very much an in-touch, progressive, sensitive minister, aware of lots of different unique situations and circumstances. He comes into contact with many, many different people in the course of his career, and I'm sure he will maintain the discretion to continue that in his consideration as well. And just finally, just to touch on Mr. Shunan's point around Bora, again, we're relitigating something that we've been over quite a few times, and I don't want to labour the point, but of course Bora is a very important part of our statutory framework, but relitigating that issue that has been well and truly covered off is boring, and I would hope that we could move on pretty quickly.
David McLeod.
I move that debate on this question now close.
I'll take a call from Tangi Aotearoa. Please
Thank
keep
you.
it relevant
Well,
to new information.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I am going to touch on 3 areas that have not been touched on yet. But before I do, can I ask the Minister whether he is intending to give a response to my question about the fee for blood being taken? Because I do think actually the committee does deserve a response around who will foot that bill in circumstances where blood is the only option available to some. Madam Chair, I want to turn to Clause 17, 1A, B, Roman 2. This is about the new opportunity for an enforcement officer to effectively engage a compulsory impairment test. One of the things that the Select Committee did hear about is the specialised training that goes into that particular test, and that not all police officers are able to actually undertake that test. My question to the Minister in that context is, has he received any advice around the ability for this to adequately be engaged as something that is complementary as part of this rollout regime? Because, Madam Chair, the Select Committee initiated these changes to allow further tools in the toolkit for enforcement officers to deal with impairment, which is what this particular bill goes at the heart at, and seeking to address that. That is not going to be any more helpful if the number of officers, particularly in rural communities, are actually not going to increase in being able to deliver on the CIT, because it's not just any pleasant. There is specified specific training and certification that is required for these CITs. So my question is how confident the Minister is, or whether he has any advice that actually there are going to be changes to the rollout of that program to ensure that actually it can work hand in hand in trying to bring down impairment, which absolutely on the side of the House we want to do and want to achieve. The other, Madam Chair, is in Clause 18, and I want to seek clarity from the Minister. This is a section that relates to circumstances where someone, the requirement for a person to undergo a further oral test if either the first or the second screening test fails to produce a result, either because, I don't know, there's some faulty or something breaks or whatever it might be. But if there is a malfunction with the first or the second screening test, as this bill indicates, and as I understand it, there would be a requirement for one further test to be given. So can the Minister confirm that in those circumstances the maximum number of oral fluid screening tests that any individual who is stopped at the roadside would undertake is a maximum of 3, that there would be no more than 3? Because if they'd done the first one and then the second one is the malfunction or a failure or what have you, that this particular clause is engaged to permit the additional one. And if that is the case, what happens after the third test and, for example, there's another malfunction? Is it that the individual simply is free to go? Is it that the police officer may engage, or the enforcement officer rather, may engage some of those other provisions that exist? My other final point, Madam Chair, is around the amendment paper in my name that I have not spoken to yet. I note the Minister in a very early contribution indicated that the government was not supportive of it. However, I invite the Minister to reflect on that. I take his point that the requirement is for the Minister of Police, and we accept here that the Minister of Police is the most appropriate person to be making these decisions. But the Minister of Police is required to consult with both the Minister of Transport and the Minister of Science. What the amendment paper does is add in there an opportunity for the Minister to effectively consult with any other ministers that he, she or they may consider as appropriate. Now, the Minister has said, well, you know, the Minister can do that anyway. The Minister has also cited, the former Minister, changing technologies in relation to this regime. This would just provide an opportunity for the Minister to turn their mind to other portfolio areas for warranted ministers where that might be appropriate. So those are new areas, and I'd look forward to the Minister's response.
Honourable James Meager.
Madam Chair, I can quickly address the couple of questions raised by the member. I don't think we need further advice on that. 71DE sets out the process for obtaining oral fluid samples that are required to be provided. You would never set a maximum limit as to the number of times you want to try to administer a test, because, for example, what happens if in the process of administering the test the particular device or implement is dropped on the ground, and you're obviously not wanting to use that particular device or test because it could be contaminated, and then what happens if, you know, it happens again and again? You know, it might be a slippery condition, rural roads, lots of gravel around, people can slip inside here and there. So we'd never want to put a maximum in place, but we do put reasonable expectations on the process, and that's all outlined in 71DE in terms of maximum numbers of tests that actually work. And how confident am I that changes to the rollout will work to bring down impairment? I'm incredibly confident that these changes will work. We have a high level of confidence in our police service. They are a tremendous group of men and women who serve our country fantastically well. I'm very proud to be supportive of the police and the role that they do in keeping our roads safe, particularly in rural and regional New Zealand, where the causes of accidents and deaths on our roads can have a disproportionately high impact, especially in a community which isn't particularly rife with drugs. So some of those issues raised around the rural sector hopefully have been well and truly covered off.
Dan Bidwell.
I move the debate on this question now close.
The question is that debate on this question now close. All those in favour say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. Party vote has been called for, please, Clerk.
New Zealand
Quiet
National.
during voting, please.
49 in favour. New Zealand Labour.
34 votes opposed.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kaumarima ngā poti whakahe.
Act New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Te Pāti Māori.
6 opposed.
The ayes are 68, the noes are 55. The question is agreed. The question is that the Minister's amendments to AP number 256 set out on AP number 257 be agreed to. All those in favour say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. A party vote has been called for, please, Clerk.
New Zealand National.
49 in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kaumarima ngā whakahe.
Act New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Party Māori.
E ono ngā pōti whakahe.
The ayes are 102, the noes are 21. The question is agreed. The question is that the Minister's amendments to Part 2 set out on AP number 256 as amended be agreed to. All those in favour say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. Party vote has been called for, please, Clerk.
New Zealand National.
49 in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kaumarima ngā whakahe.
Act New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Te Party Māori.
E ono ngā pōti whakahe.
The ayes are 102, the noes are 21. The question is agreed. The question is that Tangi Utikeri's table amendment to clause 11 be agreed to. All those in favour say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The noes have it. Party vote has been called for, please, Clerk.
New Zealand National.
49 opposed.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kaumarima ngā whakaai.
Act New Zealand.
11 votes opposed.
New Zealand First.
8 opposed.
Te Party,
E ono ngā pōti
Party Māori.
whakae.
The ayes are 55, the noes are 68. The question is not agreed. The question is that Tangi Utikeri's tabled amendment to clause 22 be agreed to. All those in favour say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The noes have it. Party vote has been called for, please, Clerk.
New Zealand National.
49 opposed.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kaumarima ngā whakaai.
Act New Zealand.
11 votes opposed.
New Zealand First.
8 opposed.
Te Party Māori.
E ono e whakae ana.
Got a wee cough.
The ayes are 55, the noes are 68. The question is not agreed. The question is that Part 2, as amended, stand part. All those in favour say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. Party vote has been called for, please, Clerk.
New Zealand National.
49 in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kaumarima ngā whakahe.
Act New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Te Party Māori.
E ono ngā pōti whakahe.
The ayes are 102, the noes are 21. The question is agreed. Members, we now come to Part 3. Part 3 is the debate on clauses 26 to 31, amendments to Parts 7, 9, 11 and 15, and Schedule 1 and the schedule. The question is that Part 3 stand part. Honourable James Meagher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just quickly go back a few seconds now. There was some consternation on the other side of the House around some of the answers to whether or not there would be maximums put in place for the number of tests you can take. I was referring to the fact that you would never put a specific maximum in terms of attempts at tests or anything like that. Of course, under 71C sub 6, the person may be required to undergo only one further oral fluid test under this section, only if a first or second screening test fails to produce a result. And what we don't want to get into a situation is where some sort of technical administrative failure, such as dropping a test on the ground, would be seen to count as a failed test. I don't think anyone would see that as being a sensible approach to this regime, in the same way that if you were taking an oral breath test, if the particular device fell on the ground, that wouldn't be counted as the first test, I'm sure. So hopefully we can clear that one up. Now, Madam Chair, Part 3, I just had a recap of the part, and it's a very, very straightforward part, only a couple of pages, and it does some very, very succinct, simple things. It inserts new Section 94A into the Act, and that's through Clause 27, which is the substantive clause, and this is the provision that requires an enforcement officer to forbid a person to drive a motor vehicle for 12 hours in certain circumstances. And now this will also include where a driver has tested positive in both roadside screening tests or where the driver fails or refuses to undergo the oral fluid screening process. Now, the amendment paper in the name of Minister Bishop adds a further ground which will require mandatory prohibition from driving where the person fails or refuses to provide an oral fluid sample without delay for laboratory testing. And that's where a sufficient sample has not been obtained from a screening test. And that harks back to some of our conversations last night around the adequacy of certain individuals' ability to produce oral fluid samples. Part 3 also inserts a new regulation making power, which will be of interest to any members of the Regulations Review Committee, to prescribe the procedure for taking, handling, retaining, transferring or disposing of an oral fluid sample. Now, these procedures will be influenced by the screening devices and laboratory services that police will use and procure under the new regime, so they will be developed after the procurement process takes place, and so therefore it is appropriate for those to be done issued under regulation. Finally, Part 3 inserts new Part 9 into Schedule 1 of the Act, depending on which part of the country you come from. This requires the Minister of Transport to appoint a reviewer to review amendments made by this bill and may also consider any amendments made by the earlier Land Transport, open bracket, drug driving, closed bracket, Amendment Act 2022, passed under the previous government. The review, which will be tabled in the House for us to consider, must be completed within 5 years of the commencement of this bill. It's important to keep the regime under regular review, given that it is a relatively complex regime. It's new to us in New Zealand. It's taken a while for us to get to this stage, so it's important that we get it in place, keep New Zealanders safe on our road, and provide some certainty about procurement and deployment of oral fluid screening devices. The review provides this House an opportunity to see how things are going, whether tweaks need to be made, and addresses a lot of the concerns raised by some members in the House today. So hopefully very, very straightforward part, hopefully well understood by all members who have read the bill, and looking forward to getting through to Part 4 next, which is a very interesting part indeed.
Honourable Julianne Genter.
Thank you very much to the Minister for that explanation. I have two issues that I'd like to speak to, and I might not be able to in one call in Part 3. The first one is to do with people being able to be banned from driving for 12 hours simply if the results of the 2 oral fluid screening tests are positive. So that, I think, previously ministers and the chair have made the point that a driver won't receive an infringement unless the laboratory sample confirms that the level is beyond the threshold. However, I don't believe there is sufficient time, and so this part means that whether or not the laboratory analysis of the oral fluid later confirms the tests were correct, they'll be mandatorily removed from driving for 12 hours. And that was one of the issues that the Attorney General raised and said they didn't think it was deemed justified for the seizure. It's also holding people up if they're unable to travel to someplace they need to travel to by driving during that 12-hour period. So I'm wondering if the Minister can just help us understand, one of the changes that is being brought in by this amendment legislation is the laboratory analysis to confirm the accuracy of the oral fluid screening device. But that is only going to apply to the infringement. It's not going to be the case that is needed to ban someone from driving for 12 hours. So just wondering if the Minister can speak to the issues raised by the Attorney General around that. Has the Minister considered other alternatives, because there still are issues with the accuracy of the tests, as has been raised by the Ministers in the Chair, the Attorney General, and many submitters during the Select Committee period. I guess what remedy is there for someone who does fail to oral fluid screening tests, but then that is not confirmed by the laboratory analysis and they were prevented from driving for 12 hours? Is there any remedy they can seek from the state for having taken away their ability to move freely with a motor vehicle at that time? Since I do still have 2 minutes in this call, I'll just raise the question about the new Part 9, because Part 9 that was inserted, was actually due to an amendment that I proposed when the previous legislation passed. And there was quite a lot of detail specifying what must be considered in the review. Now, what new Part 9 seems to be doing is removing a bunch of that detail. So there's very little direction given to the Minister and the reviewer about what should be covered by the review. And I'm wondering why that change is being made, because surely previously Parliament had considered that the bits that are being removed, that have been deleted, like considering the review must consider the following matters: the impact of the amendments, the reliability of oral fluid screening tests, laboratory analysis of oral fluid samples, blood tests in assessing a person's impairment, whether appropriate thresholds and impairment levels have been set. There's a whole range of factors that were specified under the previous Act, and now that seems to be being removed. And so all that's specified is that there's a review that may consider amendments and must report no later than 5 years, and that the Minister must respond to it. But there's no specifying what factors need to be considered in that review, and I don't understand the purpose of this change. Why wouldn't it be appropriate for it to be specified in legislation what should be considered, given that, as the Minister himself in the Chair has said, we don't yet know what the impact of this legislation will be, if it will achieve the intended outcome of reducing deaths and serious injuries, if it will achieve deterrence of impaired driving. It's entirely possible that it won't, that it can't be rolled out at scale, that impaired driving with other substances that aren't able to be tested for on oral fluid devices will increase as a result of having oral fluid screening for only certain substances. And there's a whole lot of other issues that have been raised about whether these could have a disproportionate impact on Māori and Pacifica people. I think it's really important, and the Minister himself has said this review is very important to Parliament's and the people of New Zealand's confidence in this regime, and so why have all these considerations been deleted by this part of the bill?
Thank you.
Honourable James Meakin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to give members some confidence that we will try and address all of the questions that are relevant and pertinent. Just want to very quickly address a question from Tangu Tikeri in the previous part, and with the consideration of the Chair, I think it's important to try and address those questions where we can. If a person is required to provide a blood sample because they're unable to provide sufficient oral fluid, are they required to pay a fee? Section 67 of the Act will provide that the person is liable to pay the fee. This maintains the status quo in the Act, which already exists, and of course which was passed under the previous government, where a person would have a blood test if they couldn't undertake a roadside test. But in practice, police only apply this to recover the fee if the driver is convicted of a criminal offence as part of court-ordered costs on sentencing. So hopefully that provides some assurances to the member. Secondly, just to briefly touch on Ms Genta's questions, again we raised the issue of the Attorney General's report and NZ Bora, and I would hope that we wouldn't need to traverse our position on why we think the limits placed on people's freedoms are justifiably limited by the particular importance of the purpose of the bill. I can rehash them again for the House if they'd like to hear them again. Okay, well, I'm hearing no's from one side and yes from the other. But I think it's just generally important that we recognise that this is a really important piece of legislation. We are trying to prevent drug drivers from causing havoc and chaos on our roads, and members say there's no evidence for that. Well, governments often do a lot of things where they try and make positive change, and sometimes those things work and sometimes those things don't work. And I think we've seen significant examples of that over the past 6 years where a number of things haven't worked, and so we are trying to do something which we think will work. If we can remove people who are testing positive for drugs in their system from the road, either temporarily or in some cases for a significant period of time, we think that will lead to fewer deaths and less carnage on the road. And I received some advice late last night that while in the chair, we have pretty much free rein to do whatever we like, but I won't be taking up that advice for fear of expanding the debate too far beyond the very narrow scope of the part that we've already been outlined here this morning.
Tangi Utikere.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank the Minister for those comments, because, you know, part of committee stage is to also respond to matters that the Minister raised as they are pertinent to the bill. Now, he touches on that this is a government, this is a bill that is seeking to make sure that what works well, basically, which is exactly why Labor, whilst in government, introduced legislation to address this issue. We can talk about the practicalities of how that's rolled out and how that might be reviewed, and that's pertinent to the new Part 9 that's to be inserted into the schedule, which I'll touch on in a moment. But I want to thank the Minister for his response to the question around blood sample testing. It's unfortunate that we can't kind of delve into that. That may have had an impact as to how other parties may have voted on the previous part. But I do sort of cite that there is a little bit of a disconnect in the Minister's response under the existing regime when it comes to alcohol blood testing, which relies on a conviction for cost recovery or non-cost recovery. This is not about criminal convictions. This is about infringements, and it's about demerit points. So they are two different. There is a provision in the bill that does lend itself down a criminal conviction pathway, but for the overwhelming majority of people for whom this will have an impact, they will not end up with a criminal conviction. Unless that has changed, that's a question for the Minister. Is that a new position that actually criminal convictions will now come into the fray? So whilst there is a requirement for people to have to pay for a blood sample to be tested, his response there is that actually the cost being recovered or not can be sought through criminal proceedings. This is not, and I know the Minister has a legal background in this particular frame, but anyway, I will leave that there and I'll move on to part 3.
Let's not embellish too much.
Sorry?
So let's not embellish my legal career too much.
I'll leave that for others to form their views on that. In terms of part 3, this does provide the 12-hour period. Now, we're not opposed to a prohibition on driving for a period of time. Can the Minister sort of provide some reassurance that the 12 hours is based on something? Is it that it's actually consistent with other mechanisms for forbidding someone to drive a vehicle? Of course, there are others that are a much more longer length of time. If someone's pulled over and they don't have a driver's licence, then they're forbidden to drive until they get one. In many circumstances, that is not 12 hours. So if the Minister could just provide what is the basis on the 12-hour period, and that would be quite helpful. We see a lot of this wording around or phrase about without delay. So there's a new proposal that's in the Minister's Amendment Paper 256, a new Clause 27, Subclause 1CA, fails or refuses to provide an oral fluid sample without delay. Now, how is that defined? Because a delay to me, I'm sure, will be a delay to someone else's delay is different. If we talk at Kāinga order houses being delayed in my electorate, that definition perhaps is different than others. So my question is, what does that mean? Is it context dependent? Is it related to a time frame? Although I sense that the government are not keen on having time frames when it comes to particular hours or minutes or those sorts of things. Madam Chair, I want to pick up on the new Part 9. Because I have to say I agree with the Honourable Julianne Genter. I was surprised to learn that what had been proposed is a bit of a change. I know that that's what had come through the Select Committee process, but there were a number of concerns that were raised by submitters. I look at one that's proposed to be deleted, and that was under what was the old subclause 3 under clause 29E. And that's whether the amendments have had a disproportionate impact on Māori and Pacifica people. Now, these were specific concerns that were raised through the Select Committee stage, and the element of bias that has also been raised in the debate already. So my question is, why is it that the Minister is why is the government seeking to basically not have some level of specificity around some of the concerns that have been raised? It's all good that there's going to be a review. Perhaps the 5 years actually is going to be a little bit too long. We'll talk about that in terms of commencement when we get onto that. But the proposed review, and in terms of reference, if we can call it that, is very, very broad. There are none. It's basically going to review everything. So I'm interested in wondering whether the Minister, Madam Chair.
Honourable James Meakin.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Well, let that be a lesson to me in good faith to try and answer questions that have previously gone by for fear of backtracking on previous parts already considered. So point well taken by the member not to extend that gratitude in the future. Now I will answer the questions from Julianne Genter. Ms Genter asked a question about the matters being raised by the review. There's no mandatory matters to consider. The bill, as reported back by the Select Committee, has simplified the statutory review provision. The statutory review can be wide-ranging, but does not prescribe certain matters to be considered. I think that's a sensible approach so that future governments aren't restrained by statute in terms of what they can actually review in the Act, and we wouldn't want to have to go back to amend the bill to add or remove things to be considered just so that we could then review the bill that we're amending in order to undertake a review. It's kind of a circular argument, but that's the position there. The second question from Ms Genter was, is there any remedy for persons who are stood down from driving from 2 oral fluid screening tests, but this is not confirmed by the laboratory analysis? The 12-hour stand down from driving for a person who tests positive twice at the roadside is a road safety measure, and this also addresses Mr Utikeri's question. It's intended to address immediate risks of impairment from those drug drivers who drive on our roads, cause accidents and kill innocent New Zealanders. The requirement for 2 positive tests is intended to reduce the chance of a person being stood down based on 2 false positive tests, and I think that is most of the questions that have been already raised.
Dr Lawrence Yunnan.
Madam Chair. And I also just want to, first of all, just want to remind the Minister that despite the fact that we do sometimes go back to specific reports, we are still contextualizing it in situ to the particular subsection that we are referring to. So I think it is important that we do discuss and may go back to certain evidence like the regulatory impact statement when we're referring to this bill. So that's just to remind the Minister that just because the Minister responded in the same way, it does not mean that the question we ask is not of relevance or is repetitive. Now, in light of that, my question to the Minister is also, first question to the Minister is around section 27 of part 3, subsection 2, and broadly with the replacement of section 94A1. Now, in the current legislation as it stands, the only criteria for enforcement officer to have to, because that's what must means, to have to forbid a person from driving is if the person has undergone 2 oral fluid screening tests and the result of both tests are positive. That is in the current legislation. However, what we have seen here as part of this bill is that the government has added a whole list of 6 additional criteria where the enforcement officer is able to forbid a person from driving for 12 hours period, and some just including potentially for non-compliance. That is an incredible expansion of the scope of power of the enforcement officer. And I haven't seen it in any of the regulatory statement or etc. that talks about the fact that that expansion of power for the enforcement officer has any benefit in terms of the policy intent of this bill, which is we want to see fewer people on the street who are not drug driving, which I get. But things that are non-compliant simply to fail or refuse to provide, because like I said in previously, from a perspective of privilege against self-incrimination, that's incredibly serious as a ban from driving. So I wanted to check with the Minister on what is the intent behind expanding the scope of power to the enforcement officer by allowing them to also ban driving for another additional with basically another 6 additional purposes. That's my first question. But also, sorry, in light of that, also when we're looking at section 94A subsection 3 of the principal bill, it also means that we are seeing that the enforcement officer, if one is applicable, that they're able to conduct arrest without warrant. That is even more severe in terms of the power that's been granted to the enforcement officer. So for someone to be non-compliant with wanting to provide an example, is the minister saying that they are able to be arrested without warrant? Because that is something else totally. So that's my first 2-part question. What is the rationale behind the expansion of the scope of power? And does that mean that if anyone failed this, it would also mean that they could be arrested without warrant? My second question is in relation to Schedule 1, to the schedule, which is in relation to Section 31, subsection 2 of Part 3. Now, very important that we do have a review period. That is good to see. I'm looking for, in terms of the new Part 1, Part 9, Section 29, subsection 5, it says that the review must report to the minister on the review. The reviewer must report to the minister on the review no later than 5 years after the commencement. However, my general understanding from the committee stage we have been discussing is that these tests won't be available until the end of this year, which means that even though it is 5 years, no later than 5 years of the commencement date, does that mean that it's actually no later than 4 years when the test is being implemented? That's just no real reason. It was just a clarification from the minister. So those are my 3 questions. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Honourable James Meager.
Madam Chair, very quickly, just to go back to Mr Aotearoa's questions. He raised the question, he understands that the regime only results in infringement offences. When would a driver receive a criminal conviction? I'm advised that if a driver is required to provide a blood sample, this could result in a criminal offence if the drug concentration is at the high risk level currently set out in the Act as determined through the laboratory test. An oral fluid test will only result in an infringement offence, and this has not changed. Mr Aotearoa also raised the interesting point that if you're pulled over and you don't have a licence, you're forbidden to drive until you get a licence. Well, the default status is you can't drive on the roads without a licence in the first instance, so I'm not sure if that's a comparable situation to draw on. And then Mr Shunan's questions right now, raising points about arrest without warrant. I don't think that's particularly unusual. Police officers arrest people all the time without warrants, so I'm not quite sure where that one's heading to. And also Mr Shunan raises a point about why would we extend this to control over people who fail or refuse to provide oral fluid screening tests or refuse to accompany an officer? Well, that aligns with the current regime around drink driving. It is to ensure that in the absence of those positive tests, the assumption is that there could be some impairment, and so from a risk safety perspective, the prohibition against driving for 12 hours takes that low risk approach to ensure that people who possibly are driving around our roads with drugs in their system, causing havoc, causing chaos, killing innocent New Zealanders, aren't able to do so. That's the main thrust and point of the bill. That's the main thrust and point of this part, and I think it's something that we've hopefully well and truly traversed.
Honourable Julianne Genter, is this a new point? Because it's a small part, and
Yes.
I just want to say, despite what's being said, I think we have a minister who's in the chair on behalf of another minister on his first foray into this, and I think has really actually made an effort to answer the questions as largely as possible, but I do feel I don't want to go back and repeat where we've already been. Honourable Julianne Genter.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I commend the Minister and the Chair for his able ability to address all of the questions, at least, and willingness to engage. It's very encouraging. We'd love to see that from all ministers in the Chair. Look, I just wanted to just go a little bit further into Part 9 and the changes recommended by the Select Committee, which I did not agree with. The Greens put my differing view in on this. And I do wonder if the Minister and the Government could consider going back to the original Part 9, because there was flexibility in that Part 9 to recommend through an order in Council that some of the items listed out in subclause, sorry, I get confused on the subclause numbers, so 29(1)(a)(3). The most important thing, I think, is that it was really laid out for good reason, and that was because this is a new policy, it's a new approach, and a lot of concerns were raised by submitters, both with the original legislation and in the amendment bill, that we make sure that the reviewer is totally independent of the New Zealand Police and the Ministry of Transport, and that all of those different factors that are specified are included in the review unless the Minister had a good reason and could have, through order in Council, the Governor-General could have made a good, said it shouldn't consider one of these factors. But I think the real risk is with the simplified requirements around the review that a future government could have a review that doesn't consider any of these relevant factors, and then they're complying with the law, but they're not actually addressing the issue of ensuring that the data is there, that we're addressing all of the different concerns that were raised by submitters and that are legitimate concerns. So, I personally think it's a real mistake to simplify Part 9, and there's no guarantee, Parliament will not be able to guarantee that a future government will do a substantive and meaningful review, and that's the whole point of the review. Why do a review if it's not going to cover the specific factors that that a previous Parliament thought should be considered and that submitters have raised? We just have no guarantee that this, and the whole point of the government's agenda with this legislation is to get a certain outcome. It's not to have drug testing for the sake of it. It's to result in certain outcome, which is reduced death and serious injury. We have no evidence from other jurisdictions that random roadside drug testing does reduce death and serious injury. We do have a lot of people raising issues around people being wrongly held up. We have the Attorney General saying it's not justified. So I do think that having a really robust and thorough review specified in legislation is worthwhile, and that it already, the original Part 9, had plenty of flexibility for the government to decide that a factor shouldn't be considered by the review if there was good reason.
Dr. Hamish Campbell.
I move that debate on this question now close.
The question is that debate on this question now close. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. Party vote has been called for. Please, Clerk.
New Zealand National.
49 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes opposed.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kaumarima ngā poti whakahe.
Act New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Party Māori.
6 votes no.
You got that one.
The ayes are 68, the noes are 55. The question is agreed. The question is that the Minister's amendments to Part 3 set out on AP number 256 be agreed to. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. Party vote is being called for, please, Clerk.
New Zealand National.
49 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kaumārima ngā poti whakahei.
Action New Zealand.
11 votes.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Te Pāti Māori.
6 votes opposed.
The ayes are 102, the noes are 21. The question is agreed. The question is that Part 3 as amended stand part. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Party vote is being called for. Clerk, please conduct the party vote.
New Zealand National.
49 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kaumārima ngā poti whakahei.
Action New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Te Pāti Māori.
6 votes opposed.
The ayes are 102, the noes are 21. The question is agreed. Members, we now come to Part 4. Part 4 is the debate on clauses 32 to 36, related and consequential amendments. The question is that Part 4 stand part. Honourable Chris Pink.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm grateful to members of this committee of the whole House for the discussion that's taken place already this morning. Part 4 is really related and consequential amendments, so the policy decisions that have now been agreed by the committee effectively now need to be put into effect by way of regulation change. So I won't spell all those out, but suffice to say they very much flow from those decisions having been made earlier in the legislation. For example, with the new infringement offence of failing or refusing to undergo an oral fluid screening test.
I call Lawrence Zunam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Minister. I know that we're on the last part. I have one question, and that's to do with, let's see, Clause 36, well, Section 36, subsection 5, which is to do with the amendment, well, in this case, which is to do with the amendment to the Land Transport Offences and Penalties Regulations 1999. Now, in Part 5, it does talk about introducing, after Section 59(1) of the Land Transport Act, insert 3 additional offences for penalty when it comes to demerit points. Now, we have discussed in terms of the other forms of offences, banning driving, etc., but I think this is the section where we're talking about some of the additional penalties that a person who is non-compliant in terms of wanting to undertake the oral test will face, both in terms of fines, infringement, but also more maximum penalty, infringement fees, infringement fines, or alternatively demerit points. I just want to check with the Minister with regards to these 3 additional sections that are introduced. Are they in line with other parts of that particular schedule in terms of demerit points? 75 demerit points is reasonably significant. So for that to be simply due to non-compliance seems to be a very high penalty for a, comparatively speaking, lower offence in comparison to some of the other that I'm seeing in terms of Schedule 2. So I guess the rationale is what benchmarking or consistency did the Minister or the officials took when determining the 75 demerit points?
I get it from me.
I call the Honourable Chris Pink.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the question from the member. In lieu of any, or perhaps pending any detailed advice that I might receive in terms of the extent to which these penalties of 75 demerit points would be considered to be in line with other demerit point levels or penalties more generally. I think, if I may say, that the point is really more that the government views the seriousness of those offences, for example, failing or refusing to remain at a specified place or to accompany an enforcement officer without delay, as being sufficiently serious to merit that degree of penalty with those 75 demerit points. So in terms of alignment relative to other penalties that are existing within the regulations, I think the point is more so that we want to send a signal that these are actions or behaviours that we don't wish to condone, and so a sufficiently serious message should be sent in respect of those.
The question is that that Part 4 stand part. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. A party vote is called for. Mr. Clark.
New Zealand National.
49 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kaumā rima, ngā poti whakahei.
Act New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Te Pāti Māori.
6 votes opposed. Could I ask the Green Party to repeat their vote, please?
Te kaumā rima, ngā poti whakahei.
Thank you. Members, the ayes are 102, the noes are 21. The question is agreed to. We now come to the schedule. The question is that the schedule stand part. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. A party vote is called for, Mr. Clark.
New Zealand National.
49 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kaumā rima, ngā poti whakahei.
Act New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Te Pāti Māori.
6 votes opposed. The ayes are 102, the noes are 21. The question is agreed to. Members, we now come to our final debate, and that is on clauses 1 to 3. This is the debate on the title, commencement and principal act. I call Tangi Utikiri.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We are at the final stages of this bill through committee, and I don't intend to trifle with the title. I think the title should always generally be what it appears to seek to deliver, and the title as proposed there, I think, is a sensible one. The questions that I do want to pose to the Minister in the Chair is around commencement. Now, Minister Bishop, in his amendment paper 256, has proposed a change in date for when this would come into effect. It doesn't actually propose a change in when it would come into effect. It proposes a change if the order in council is not made, the time frame by which it comes into effect. And so what was originally proposed was that it would be by the first anniversary of royal assent. That has been changed, or suggested to be changed, to the 1st of April 2026, which could give the government a little bit more time, perhaps, to roll that out, although we're talking a matter of weeks here, if that is in fact the case. My question to the Minister is he comfortable that everything is all lined up in order to deliver on commencement? We have heard from Minister Mega, who was initially in the chair last night, that operationally this should come into play by Christmas or by December. And so there were questions around that. And it might be that the Minister may need to take advice on this. I'm not too sure. He's a very astute Minister, so maybe he won't. But I think it is important to understand what possible implications will be, why it is that the Transport Minister has sought to extend this, albeit by a shorter period of time. That would be the first one. I don't think there is any benefit in seeking to litigate the Principal Act. This simply will amend the Land Transport Act of 1998. But really, I am interested in when this will basically kick in. Often I get that there needs to be a lead-in period for this. We are talking about the procurement of devices. This is something that the Select Committee did turn its mind to when it was progressing through this. One of the concerns that members on this side of this side of the House do have and continue to have is that this legislation should never be driven by procurement of devices, but is the genesis in making the change an omission of sorts that actually there might be some issue with procuring devices. Maybe not. The Minister might be in a position, based on officials' advice, to indicate that actually no, everything is well on track to deliver things come Christmas, but commencing things to ensure that 1st of April 2026 is a change, and I'd be interested in the Minister's thoughts around that as well.
I'll call the Honourable Chris Pink.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the member for his nuanced but important question. My understanding is, acknowledging the point he's made around the pragmatic considerations as to procurement, introduction of technology and so on, that a certain amount of time is of course necessary for this legislation to become effective. And of course the structure of the commencement clause is such that an order in council could bring forward or introduce as soon as reasonably possible such measures, pending that technology being purchased, available, presumably tested and so on. But competing those traditional tensions between flexibility and certainty, allowing some sort of backstop provision by having in the second part of the commencement provision a date by which we know the legislation will come into effect, regardless of whether an order in council has been provided in the meantime, explains why there is a particular date at clause 2, subclause 2. And as the members rightly noted, there is in fact a slight difference between the original intention, being the first anniversary of royal assent having been given, on the one hand, and as now being proposed, the 1st of April 2026. We think, it seems to me that in these cases almost always it's the fact that with a particular calendar date you provide certainty and clarity in a way that doesn't require the presupposition that a person would know when royal assent has been given and then needing to add 12 months to that. So I think it's maximum clarity, but also that flexibility of being able to introduce the law as soon as possible, notwithstanding that that the expectation is very much that would have taken place by 1 April of next year.
I call Lawrence Zunan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will have just a few questions, and I'll be really quick about it, and kind of following up from the questions around procurement. I guess the first part, I think going back to the procurement issue in general is there a requirement for this bill to be passed before procurement is able to be procured? It's being the first question, but I guess the second question is, what is the current level of conversation around commencement date, noting that probably a lot of that hinges on procurement, but as we see as part of the debate we've done throughout this bill, that particularly I'm looking at section 22, the newly introduced 71G, subsection 6 and 7, that there are specific requirements to how that procurement needs to be done, and as well as in terms of things like labeling or appearance on printed matter as accompanying device. I wondered if there's any conversation that's been already discussed, either a decision has already been made from a procurement perspective that what we will be procuring already meet the requirement under that particular section, or if there's a conversation yet to be had with potential sources for this procurement, understanding there's a level of confidentiality around the contract. But I just want to check with the Minister, has there been a conversation with potential sources of procurement around whether they are already going to be compliant with the requirements of this bill, or that conversation has yet to be had in anticipation for this bill being commenced and being passed?
Madam Chair.
The Honourable Chris Pink.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank the member for this latest question. I think while I would be unwise to speculate on the extent to which discussions around procurement are advanced sufficiently to know exactly how that will play out, I do observe that sometimes there's a chicken and egg proposition whereby if procurement only should take place in accordance with the requirements of the law as determined by legislation, nevertheless one needs to pass the legislation in order to set those wheels in motion, but one is doing that, I guess, somewhat blind to the extent that we don't know exactly what will be available in terms of that equipment. I'm very confident, and I'm sure that the Minister in whose shoes I'm standing metaphorically would be confident that the procurement is going to take place in an orderly fashion, and I would be surprised if at least some awareness of the market and the opportunities in the space isn't already held within our government, because of course that's somewhat presupposed by the idea that we can introduce this legislation and of course be able to meet those government aims, and I'm sure the aims of every right-thinking New Zealander and member of this House, that we avoid the evil that is drug driving and the danger that it poses to us.
Madam Chair. I call Dan Bidwell.
I move the debate on this question now close.
The question is that debate on this question now close. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. A party vote is called for, Mr Clerk.
New Zealand National.
49 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes opposed.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kau mā rima ngā poti whakahei.
11 votes in
Act New
favour.
Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Te Pāti Māori.
6 votes opposed.
Members, the ayes are 68, the noes are 55. The question is agreed to. The question is that Clause 1 stand part. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. A party vote is called for, Mr Clerk.
New Zealand National.
49 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kau mā rima ngā poti whakahei.
Act New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand
8
First.
votes in favour.
Te Pāti Māori.
6 votes opposed.
Members, the ayes are 102, the noes are 21. The question is agreed to. The question is that the Minister's amendment to Clause 2 set out on AP number 256 be agreed to. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. A party vote is called for, Mr Clerk.
New Zealand National.
49 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kau mā rima ngā poti whakahei.
Act New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand
8
First.
votes in favour.
Te Pāti Māori.
6 votes opposed.
Members, the ayes are 102, the noes are 21. The question is agreed to. The question is then that Clause 2, as amended, stand part. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. A party vote is called for, Mr Clerk.
New Zealand National.
49 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Te kau mā rima ngā poti whakahei.
Act New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand
8
First.
votes in favour.
Te Pāti Māori.
6 votes opposed.
The ayes are 102, the noes are 21. The question is agreed to. The question is that clause 3 stand part. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. A party vote is called for, Mr. Cole.
New Zealand National.
49 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Tacoma Rima Napote Whakahei.
ACT New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand.
8 votes in favour.
Te Pāti Māori.
6 votes opposed.
The ayes are 102, the noes are 21. The question is agreed to. I will report this bill with amendment. Turn to the taxation annual rates for 2024-25, emergency response and remedial measures bill. When we were last debating this bill, we were debating part 2. This is the debate on clauses 4 to 115, amendments to Income Tax Act 2007. The question again is that part 2 stand part.
Madam Chair.
I call the Honourable Scott Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thought it might be useful, because this debate had been interrupted, that we might just reappraise ourselves of where we're at, and in particular part 2 of this quite significant piece of legislation. So for the benefit of members in committee today, part 2 of the bill contains amendments to the Income Tax Act of 2007, and as such this part includes improvements to the approved insurer levy debt investment rules, the generic response measures for emergency events, and simplifications for transferring overseas pensions to New Zealand. And the increases to the thresholds for exempt employee share schemes. There are a range, in fact many other smaller remedial changes that are included in this part of the bill, and there is also an amendment paper that includes a few changes to this part as well. So those matters will include measures, for instance, to ensure that the appropriate tax outcomes for artists who receive resale royalties are achieved, and it grants the Auckland Future Fund, which is connected to Auckland Council, an exemption from income tax. And it also adds New Zealand's Memorial Museum Trust, Le Kunwa, to the list of overseas donee organisations, and makes some minor technical changes to items that are already included in the bill.
I call the Honourable Deborah Russell.
Madam Chair, I'd just like to thank the Minister for that summary of some of the issues that are in part 2. I do just want to traverse a little bit of where we were at in the debate. And what we were working through is we're making a quite methodical process through part 2, going clause by clause. Of course, not particularly concentrating on clauses was just involved, say, substituting a heading or putting a new heading to a section, because that would be a little ridiculous. But we were working through the substantive issues that are contained within this tax bill. And I do note, as the Minister said, there are some substantial issues in this part of the bill, and particularly the emergency provisions, which we haven't quite worked our way towards yet. So I am looking forward to discussing those in depth. There are, however, some clauses that come in before those new emergency provisions come in, and we do want to work our way through them bit by bit by bit. So I think the furthest in debate that we had gotten on last, it was last Wednesday night, that would be right, last Wednesday night, so some time ago now, was that we had gotten to, I think my colleague, the Honourable Barbara Edmonds, was discussing clause 16B, and I had been concerning myself with some of the issues in clause 20. Now, I understand my colleague Megan Woods may have a question or two more on clause 20, but I want to move just one step further, add a 1 to that, and we go to clause 21. And that is the measures around the thresholds for exempt employee share schemes. Now, the interesting thing is that these exempt employee share schemes would often be used with startup companies and the like as a way of remunerating employees. So it is and in that space, but it's a way of incentivising employees. It's a way of ensuring that people have a stake beyond a job or a stake in the firm that they are working for. And that seems on the whole to be a good thing. The curious thing is that when we were last discussing this bill, it was on a day when the government had asserted that they were all about growth, or growth, or growth. If you say it enough times, it really happens. And so we were interested, and we asked several questions of the Minister as to the measures in this bill that could be considered to be growth measures. And the Minister came back with the approved issuer levy amendments, which is pretty trivial. So there's a couple of questions here, given that it was the only measure that the Minister came up with at the time. They have. Having had a little bit of time to reflect on how growth gets to be done, whether the Minister regards this particular amendment in the tax bill that's proposed in the tax bill, where we are increasing the thresholds for exempt employee share schemes, whether the Minister regards that as a measure designed to promote growth too, or whether it is just one of those annual sort of inflation adjustments that happens from time to time. So I would like the Minister to to comment perhaps on whether or not it is a growth measure, what it's going to add to growth, how it might promote the New Zealand economy, because it does seem to me that it could probably fit within that space. But then the curious thing is why the Minister focused on the approved issuer levy last week instead of talking about this as a growth measure. Because this, the approved issuer levy. Now, I did ask the Minister in the debate last week, we haven't, I did foreshadow I was going to ask this again, I did ask the Minister to come back to us with whether there had been any assessment of the revenue impact of the changes to the approved issuer levy, because he had asserted it would lead to growth in the economy, and I said it would be nice to see some numbers to back that up. So I'm hoping that the officials have had time to work those numbers up and that the Minister will come back to us on that approved issuer levy. But the other thing I would like to know is, so two questions there. One, is it a growth measure? Two, if so, why didn't the Minister mention it last week? But then the third question here is, what is the assessment of how much growth might come about as a result of this particular change in the Income Tax Act?
I call the Honourable Barbara Edmonds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's again another good privilege to be able to stand up and to continue the debate on the taxation bill. Again, I acknowledge the Minister's earlier comments around some of the more significant policy issues in the bill, but also I want to affirm where we got up to the debate a week ago. And at the time, I was currently debating with the Minister and had a number of questions around Clause 16B of the bill. And just to recap for some members, the bill obviously is an omnibus tax bill. It has a number of both substantive policy issues, which the Minister outlined earlier in his comments, but also it has a number of remedials. And some of the remedials that we started to discuss in the last part of the debate was around the land rules remedials. So these are the remedials which are covered within within clauses 16B. Members will note in the revised track version of the bill that actually clause 16 has been totally wiped out. That was what the original bill, when it was introduced, we had a clause 16. That has totally been revised during our select committee process, and we now have this new clause 16B, which looks to amend section CW3C of the Income Tax Act. So as a recap, what those land use rules are, they are remedials. However, they are important remedials because there was a change in an earlier tax bill around the bright line test. So the bright line test, for those members can remember, it was introduced by John Key at 2 years. It was then extended to 5 years, extended to 10 years by the Labor government. And then one of the first bills that came in, tax bills under this new government, they removed it from 10 years back to 2 years. So it's quite clear that the remedials which are contained in this bill try to fix some of those corrections from some of those changes. And so those land rule remedials ensure that the bright line period is not restarted when a co-owner acquires land from another co-owner on partition or subdivision. I did talk about that a little bit in the previous part of this debate. Ensuring the new bright line test does not apply to transfers of inherited land by a beneficiary of an estate. The policy intention behind that when the Right Honourable John Key put those provisions in 2015 was to ensure that there was rollover relief, particularly in a transfer of an estate. The other remedials in this bill also include ensuring the provisions provide rollover relief for bright line test applies to those in civil unions, de facto relationships, as well as marriages. Again, it was just around that if there is a divorce or a separation, it is relationship property, that there is some rollover relief in that particular circumstance, and ensuring that the rules also, the remedials also ensure that the rules apply when land is acquired on a subdivision between co-owners and is subsequently disposed of as operated as intended. So going back specifically to some of the drafting for Clause 16B, because I did ask the Minister, it was a very big change that was recommended, a very big change, and we weren't able to go back to submitters to cross-check some of those changes, so it really was up to the Select Committee to basically trust officials that how it's been drafted both affirms what submitters had come through with, but also was technically correct. So I asked the Minister for his assurance around this big change. He obviously provided it at the time. But there was one particular issue which I think, upon reading, having a bit more time to read that particular clause, and it was an issue that was raised actually by the New Zealand Law Society, in which officials at the time believed shouldn't be changed. So I want to clarify with the Minister, particularly around that drafting, whether the officials, given it was a huge drafting change in the new clause 16B, whether he's received any additional advice from officials since we have now reported it back around this drafting, what the Law Society, and I can see why the Law Society believe it's a drafting error, and also to see whether the Minister has had any more official advice around it. So that is in particular, and that's around the rollover provisions and the application of Section FC 9(4) in the Income Tax Act to these provisions. So under Section FD1 of the Income Tax Act 2007, the Act states that the section applies for the purposes of CB6A, that is the bright line test, CB16A, and Part D of the Income Tax Act. However, Section FD1, Madam Chair.
I call Honourable Barbara.
Thank you, Madam Chair. However, Section FD1 of the Income Tax Act also applies for the purposes of Section FC 9, subsection 4. And so the question that the Law Society, in which I just want to get confirmation from the Minister, from his officials, is whether that Section FD1, subsection 1, should actually include a reference to Section FC 9(4). And so I think the Law Society obviously submit on a number of bills. They actually have a specialised group within the Law Society, a tax advisory group, who review all the different types of bills and provide submissions. And so they're very senior law practitioners and very respected law practitioners too. So they raised the issue about whether it should apply for the purposes of the bright line test, and whether the Act should be, whether the bill should be amended to include it. So I just want to ask the Minister whether he's received any additional advice since the bill has been reported back, whether that change should be done as suggested by, as recommended by the Law Society, and what advice does he stand upon in which officials have declined their submission. But I think it's actually a relevant question, particularly for the drafting, and particularly because we weren't able to take back the revised revised track version of the bill to submitters to again ensure that the drafting was both accurate or that it actually still made sense. So it is a minor question in the scheme of things, but it's one that I think, given we haven't had an opportunity to retest it, just would like to seek some more reassurance from the Minister. Madam Chair.
I call the Honourable Scott Simpson.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to thank both the Honourable Deborah Russell and the Honourable Barbara Edmonds for their contributions in this debate. Just starting with the last question from Barbara Edmonds, I'm advised that the Minister has not received any further advice on the drafting of Clause 16B, notwithstanding the submission from the Law Society. But I want to come to the issues raised by the Honourable Deborah Russell relating to growth. And I'm very pleased that she's on message, on track, and she is receiving loud and clear what this government is all about. Because these changes actually will assist, for instance, exempt employees in terms of their share schemes. And the purpose of the change is actually to make it easier for companies to attract talent and keep talent. That's what it's all about. And so in a time when New Zealand needs to attract talent, when companies and entities need to grow and thrive, the retention and recruitment of talent is an important part of it. So that's a very simple example, Madam Chair, of how this relatively simple but important change can help with the growth strategy of this government.
The Honourable Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the Minister and the Chair for his answers to the questions. As my colleagues have indicated, we are going through this clause by clause. So the answer to the question that my colleague, the Honourable Barbara Edmonds, put about whether or not the Minister had sought advice, it's useful for us to understand now that the Minister hasn't sought advice on the law submission, but we would like to know, will the Minister be in the future seeking advice around that advice? As my colleague intimated, this is a very expert group of tax professionals that have highlighted what could be some significant drafting errors. So in terms of, is this something that the Minister intends to pursue and look at and think about whether or not this does need a fix in the future? But Madam Chair, as my colleague, the Honourable Deborah Russell, intimated, the clause that I've got some specific questions around is Clause 20. Now, this is part of a suite of clauses that are covering off emergency events. Of course, as a Parliament and as governments over a number of years across multiple governments, we've dealt with responding to emergency events in quite ad hoc ways. Have significant experience, of course, of how that was dealt with in the Canterbury earthquake sequences and how the emergency provisions applied here. But Clause 20 inserts a new section, CW 19B, around certain amounts derived by employees during emergency events and the exempt income. So this is a prelude to some of the more meatier emergency provisions, which we'll get on in questions around subsequent clauses as we go through. But this is an important one nonetheless, Madam Chair. This is around income that is associated with accommodation, and workers that need to come in and have accommodation in the event of a significant emergency event. So one of the things that this says is the income that satisfies Section FP 1320 or certain amounts derived by employees during emergency events is exempt income to the extent to which the income is A, accommodation, B, less than or equal to $5,000 in total if the income is in the form other than accommodation. Now, Madam Speaker, this is both an insertion, but then there's been a redrafting through the committee in terms of the track changes bill. So in terms of drafting questions that go with this now we all know in this House that a colon is used to introduce what follows. It serves two functions, and this is important in terms of the drafting of this Clause 20 of the bill. It can be used as a list or an explanation But it can, but it doesn't necessarily link to independent clauses. So the question is whether that $5,000 is indeed a cap if accommodation is directly paid by an employer, or whether it is an either or in terms of obviously the second point there is around the instance of reimbursing. So whether it's income in the form other than accommodation. Obviously you wouldn't want to be taxing people that have gone into help in the aftermath of an emergency situation. But I think given that there has been quite a change in the drafting there, it would be useful to know, for us to know what purpose that colon is serving in this clause, Madam Chair, whether or not this is indeed a cap that has been introduced, and if it is related to the direct payment of accommodation as well as the reimbursement, what the justification for that would be. Indeed, what is the justification when you're talking about a reimbursement? There are emergency events that have differing durations, and it's possible for us to imagine an employee that is actually going to need more than $5,000 of accommodation if this is indeed, we're talking about an entire tax year, and there may be a long period of time that will be required in terms of that. So what exceptions there can be to that cap if there is still scope to have flexibility and to respond to the nature of the disaster. Of course, we are entirely supportive of us having a more streamlined way in which we deal with natural disasters and the tax relief that needs to apply there, but look forward to the answers from the Minister.
Lawrence Sunan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of really specific questions for the Minister on Section 19 of Part 2, which is the new Section CW171D on payments relating to health and safety. So, understanding the current system pertaining to this section, particularly in the what has been referred to Section CX24, is around the benefit has to be, the fringe tax is exempted if it's referring to managing health and safety, but it's particularly to do with things that the employer may be providing for the employee. However, what we're seeing here is under subsection 1, it says applies to when the employer pays an amount to or on behalf of relating to the health and safety. But I kind of wanted to check in terms of pays amount to on behalf of, is this to do with I guess a financial or actual monetary amount that's being provided to an employee, so that way they are able to keep themselves safe at work or managing the risk to health and safety in the workplace. Because I guess the question there is, is this amount, which may be monetary, being given to the employee for them to buy equipment that then they can use as part of their health and safety and mitigating risks at the workplace? Or is it some sort of other payment? Because understanding that we're also looking at the fact that this amount is exempted income under subsection 2. But the question there, and in terms of exempted from fringe tax, but the question there is for a benefit that would be excluded by section CX24. Now, the issue with CX24 is that there are 3 subclauses when we're looking at the benefit that is that is provided to an employee is not a fringe benefit to the extent, and C of that, and each of those clauses is in conjunction, it's and, so you have to have all 3. But part of that, in terms of CX24C, talks about the fact that it is excluded from section CX23 from being a fringe benefit if provided on the employer's premise. So if we're taking the fundamental element of the exemption from fringe tax being on the employer's premise, how does it relate to then subsection 1, where it says it pays an amount on behalf of amount 2 on behalf of the employee when that amount may be off premise? So just kind of some questions around the context of why this particular section was introduced. The circumstance was introduced. Are we looking at paying amount on behalf of in order to for the employee to be able to purchase equipment that will manage risks to their health and safety, or the company's or the employer's health and safety as a PCBU under the Health and Safety at Work Act, and also in terms of subclause 2, if we're seeing that one of the criteria for exemption of fringe benefit under section CX24 is that the benefit must be provided on premise, how then would it relate to the payment amount when that payment amount to the person may be used off premise? Thank you.
Madam Chair.
I call the Honourable Scott Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to again thank members for their useful and probing questions, particularly the Honourable Megan Woods, who knows well from her personal experience of being in government that ministers receive information, advice and supportive submissions from a variety of sources, organisations, not the least of which is the Law Society, on very regular basis. So she can take assurance from that. I think that notwithstanding the formal process, organisations such as the Law Society are never backward in coming forward in terms of offering advice to ministers or governments. She asked some questions specifically around emergency events, and the whole purpose of the Clause 20 changes are to actually provide certainty. I think any legislation that assists in providing certainty, depending on the nature of the event, which can sometimes be uncertain, that is helpful. So the drafting is intended to provide that subsequent recovery phase, some certainty for people who are involved. Lawrence Unan asked some questions around Clause 19, and particularly in relation to fringe benefit tax. And there are some good questions in that, particularly relating to the fringe benefit tax liability if a benefit occurs on an employer's premises. And I can remember from my own days of being in business situations, for instance, whether providing a barbecue sausage sizzle at the end of the working week, was that considered a fringe benefit type contribution to the employee? I think some of this is a matter of degree, some of it is actually a matter of just good judgment.
Members, the government has indicated that it wishes to lift urgency, so I will be reporting progress. So I'll just do these two.
The House is resumed.
Madam Speaker, the committee has considered the Land Transport Drug Driving Amendment Bill and reports it with amendment. The committee has also further considered the Taxation Annual Rates for 2024-25 Emergency Response and Remedial Measures Bill and reports that it has made no progress on this bill. I'll just repeat that last part. On the Emergency Response and Remedial Measures Bill, and reports that it has made progress.
Thank you.
No? I'm sorry, we have to get the wording right.
question, because you said remedial. So progress on the bill, and then these two are no progress.
Correct. Do I have to report that?
Yeah, you've got to report those ones as well. So if you could just start again. And this one has made progress, so read this one, and then these two are no progress.
Madam Speaker, the committee has also further considered the taxation annual rates for 2024-25 emergency response and remedial measures bill, and reports that it has made progress on the bill. The committee has also further considered the sentencing reform amendment bill and reports that it has made no progress on the bill. And the committee has also considered the customer and product data bill and reports that it has made no progress on the bill. Madam Speaker, I move that the report be received.
The question is that the report be adopted. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The report is adopted. The Land Transport Drug Driving Amendment Bill is set down for third reading next sitting day. The Taxation Annual Rates for 2024-25 Emergency Response and Remedial Measures Bill, the Sentencing Reform Amendment Bill, and the Customer and Product Data Bill are set down for further consideration in committee next sitting day. The House is now adjourned until 2 p.m. today.